Chapter 5:18. Yi Shiwen waved his hand, collected these spirit crystals, and put them inside the heavenly source mirror. These spirit crystals were the protective barrier with the help of which those mountain beasts had been flourishing. However, they had fallen into Yi Ziwen's hands now. It could be said that one spirit crystal could be exchanged for 100 primary spirit dawn. In fact, one could get an even higher number of primary spirit dawn if they exchanged it in the black market. However, he didn't wish to exchange these spirit crystals. Spirit crystals could be exchanged for primary spirit dawn with ease. However, it was difficult to exchange primary spirit dawn for the spirit crystals. Yi Shiwen must find a place to absorb these spirit crystals. And his cultivation would perhaps attain a brand new progress once that had happened. Yi Shiwen had barely emerged from the underground cave when energy fluctuations appeared in the sky. And it was accompanied by the emergence of a flying fire meteor that illuminated half of the horizon. They were the meteor sex people. Yi Shiwen immediately restrained his breath, and he operated the restraining breath technique to its capacity. His entire body sank into the subspace and got concealed therein. In fact, he didn't even set off any fluctuations in this process. His restraining breath technique had reached at a new realm once he had entered the sage realm. Consequently, even a great sage expert would find it difficult to discover him once he had concealed his presence. Of course, this was subject to the condition that he mustn't move. Therefore, he was confident that a sage expert couldn't discover his existence by any means. He didn't need to worry about being discovered unless his presence had been locked on to by the enemies. The flying fire meteor had already reached above Yi Shiwen within a few breaths. He swept out his divine sense and found a few familiar faces on that flying fire meteor. The Great Wei Empire's second prince and third prince were present along with their subordinates. He had seen them separating from each other beforehand. However, they had somehow gathered together at this time. A young man was standing at the top of the flying fire meteor. He was tall and handsome. His outstanding aura was quite threatening. He was dressed in the meteor sex standard uniform. However, he had a special air about him. The flying fire meteor came to a halt in front of the underground cave of the mountain beasts. Everyone got down from it and swept their glances over the entire place. The third prince spoke up somewhat remorsefully, "We are late. He has escaped. I didn't expect that this dragon master would be so sly. He's one slippery bastard. I think he's a poisonous snake. A viper that can bite you anywhere and anytime." The second prince opened his mouth and said. In fact, he had said this as he had looked towards that young man who was standing in front of everyone and seemed like the leader of this group. "Has someone from our side leaked the news and allowed him to get away?" A prince's consecrate opened his mouth and speculated. "It's impossible. We had departed at the same time. And now we have gathered together. So, he couldn't have obtained news, let alone escape in advance." The third prince denied and said. They had planned to deal with Yi Shiwen from the get-go. It had seemed that they had scattered when they had departed. However, they had gathered together soon after that. Therefore, nobody here could say that the news might have gotten leaked. They had been pursuing Yi Shiwen since the last few months. And they had finally obtained the news of him being present in this vicinity with great difficulty. Therefore they had rushed straight here. However, it seemed that Yi Shiwen hadn't left long ago. Look at this mess. It's obvious that this dragon master has left recently. Moreover, it doesn't appear like he has left in a hurry after getting the news. I can only say that this guy's luck is very good. He must have left very recently from the looks of it. So, shouldn't we purse him? Someone asked. Yi Shiwen had now understood that why these experts of the Great Wei State's imperial clan had left so quickly at that time. They had been planning to deal with him. Moreover, they had also brought the experts of the meteor sect along with them. That young man's imposing aura was suppressive and threatening. He looked suave and outgoing. He had already entered the small perfection level of the sage realm. So, he was a step ahead of the peak level of the sage realm. Each martial art move of the peak level of the sage realm has a standard style as per the comparison based on the practice moves. But these different styles can be linked up together in order in the case of small perfection level of the sage realm. So, there wouldn't be any gap in between the moves as a result of this linking. And this meant that there was a big power gap between the two realms. Furthermore, one could easily use these styles in an unorganized sequence once they had reached the great perfection level of the Sage realm. One could disrupt the order of these moves. And one wouldn't need to adhere to the sequence of the styles. Therefore, the experts of Sage Great Perfection realm could unleash these moves at will, and without following any order. Consequently, they could cast a move at the time of unleashing the attack, but that move could get transformed into some other move when the attack would finally get materialized. The Sage Small Perfection realm was more incredible than the Sage Peak realm. In fact, these two realms were almost entirely at different levels. There's no need. He's just a small fish and nothing more. He can't stir up mighty waves in the sea, the young man said disdainfully. It was obvious that he didn't give a damn about Yi Shiwen. Many senior experts of our meteor sect have arrived. So, what's he? He's nothing. You don't need to worry. Of course, you are right, Brother Sheng Feiyue. That Dragon Master isn't an issue for a talented man like you. I only suspect that those two belong to some organization, and they might secretly wish to topple the rule of our meteor sect. The second prince said. He had hit the nail on the head. He had harbored doubts about the origins of Yi Shiwen and the Wood Dragon since the beginning. After all, he hadn't been able to find anything about the backgrounds of both these individuals. And this was the most dreadful thing for him. I will go and report this matter to the higher-ups. The sect will investigate and find the origins of both these individuals. This is our meteor sect's domain. It's ridiculous if they think that they can topple our meteor sect's rule. They think too highly of themselves if they are embracing such a notion. They are overconfident. Sheng Feiyu's face exposed a disdainful smile. His confidence had originated from the formidable strength of the meteor sect. They had been ruling the meteor world since countless years. Moreover, they hadn't declined even once, unlike the true Martial University. The meteor world was their territory. Therefore, he believed that those two were thinking too highly of themselves if they thought that they could topple their rule in their backyard. They were overreaching themselves. A mysterious light suddenly flashed in Yi Zaiwen's eyes. The Northern Dipper's objective wasn't to topple the meteor sect's rule. The Northern Dipper had tyrannical strength. However, they had a very few personnel in their ranks. So, their combined strength was far from rivaling that of the meteor sects. Therefore, they wouldn't go for a head-on confrontation with the meteor sect by attempting to topple their rule. However, this matter was tied to planting a Northern Dipper saboteur in the meteor sect. It wasn't clear when this saboteur would prove his usefulness. After all, Yi Shiwen didn't even know how many such saboteurs the Northern Dipper commanded. However, the 23rd Prince was very important for Yi Shiwen since this would be his first base of operation for obtaining resources from the Great Wei Empire at a steady rate. This obviously wouldn't satisfy his ever-increasing requirement of resources. However, it would still be a steady source of income for him. Therefore, the consequences would be disastrous for Yi Shiwen if he ended up attracting the attention of a sect as enormous as the meteor sect. After all, the meteor sect had been ruling the meteor world for so many years. So, they wouldn't show any mercy if someone tried to topple their rule. Therefore, he couldn't allow them to spread this news. And this meant that he would need to annihilate the sources of the news before that. That Dragon Master is only an irksome fly, nothing more. He's nothing. They aren't a match for our meteor sect. Sheng Feiyue said. Yi Shiwen and his trusted aide could prove to be a big trouble for the second prince. However, they were nothing for him. He had such belief and confidence, and he also had the strength to back it up. Moreover, he was also confident that Yi Shiwen would be a mere peak-level expert of the Sage realm at most. However, he himself had already entered the Sage Small Perfection realm. Therefore, he would crush Yi Shiwen to death if the latter dared to appear. This ancient world was once the headquarters of the deceased bereaved clan. So, this place has countless precious treasures. My cultivation will advance by leaps and bounds as long as I obtain even one of these ancient treasures. Won't I be able to suppress that Dragon Master at that time as well? So, what if he is a great master of alchemy? I will crush him to death with ease. Sheng Feiyue coldly said. Sheng Feiyue sat down on the flying fire meteor after he said this. Then he urged to fly forward. It transformed into a grandiose streamer of light and disappeared in the horizon. Yi Shiwen came out of the void. His pupils contracted, and a cold intention flickered in his eyes. A pair of golden wings suddenly appeared on his back. He then opened his wings, transformed into a golden streamer, and chased after them at a speed that was even quicker than theirs. He didn't have a divine flying tool like the flying fire meteor. However, his devil wings were an extremely powerful magical ability in their own merit. In fact, he could even travel back and forth between myriads of worlds once it had been practiced to the pinnacle. This was the strongest aspect of the devil wings. Yi Shiwen caught up with Sheng Feiyue and other people soon enough. However, he didn't act rashly and didn't alert them of his presence. Instead, he decided to hang behind them. He had restrained his breath with the help of restraining breath technique. And he was outside their line of sight. Moreover, he was using his divine sense to examine their actions. However, they couldn't discover his presence. Sheng Feiyue was driving the flying fire meteor. So, he was in the front. He had attracted the attentions of many demon beasts en route. However, how could those ancient demon beasts be a match for him? They had obviously been crushed by these people. Yi Shiwen was steadily pursuing them. And a blur silhouette of the enlightening mind ancient tree was present behind him. Consequently, he had never been so clear-headed. He was pursuing Sheng Feiyue and the others on the one hand. And he was undergoing practice on the other. In fact, he felt that his cultivation was already at a critical juncture. He felt that he would reach the intermediate stage of the sage realm if he could make another breakthrough at this time. His fighting strength could be compared to that of an expert of the sage small perfection realm once that had happened. And then he could blow up this arrogant Sheng Feiyue with a single punch. He just needed to wait. The look in Yi Ziwen's eyes was charged by thousands kinds of tricks. All kinds of plans and schemes had appeared in his mind one by one. His attitude had become unprecedentedly peaceful under the effect of the enlightening mind ancient tree. His killing intention had certainly become stronger with the passage of time. However, that hadn't had the slightest of effect on his rational mind. So, he could still think of all sorts of schemes in a calm manner. Time passed day by day. And it had soon been more than a month ever since Yi Shiwen had started to pursue Sheng Feiyue and the others. Sheng Feiyue and the others had gone on expeditions in all directions in this more than a month's time. And they had also come across dangers several times. However, they had escaped all dangers. They had also obtained many benefits during this time. They had already ventured deep into the underground world of the heavenly pit by now. They had also come across increasingly powerful ancient demon beasts as they had gone farther into the depths of this underground world. Many of those demon beasts had attained spiritual intelligence and had established their own ancient demon beast kingdoms. And that too in perfect order. Yi Shiwen had been amazed at the sight of this. Everyone had arrived in front of a huge mountain at this time. There's something wrong about this huge mountain. I think it's a massive ancient demon beast. Chapter 519. Everyone was surprised to see this gigantic mountain when they arrived in front of it. They noticed that it was a mountain range that had stretched up to more than 1,000 kilometers. In fact, it was so huge that they couldn't see its boundary. There's something wrong about this huge mountain. Wait, this is a huge ancient beast. The second prince exclaimed on top of the flying fire meteor. He had realized that this wasn't a huge mountain. Instead, it was the corpse of an incomparably huge ancient demon beast. The corpse of this ancient demon beast had gotten covered with layers of dusts with the passage of time. Thus, it had eventually formed such a huge sierra. It was covered with layers of dusts and had passed through countless years of transformation. However, everyone quickly found out that this was a beast's corpse once they calmed down. They swept their divine senses through the layers of dusts and saw that there was a gigantic beast under that cover of earth. Its entire body was covered with ice-cold black scales. Moreover, it seemed as if molten iron had poured out from its body and had then submerged into the dust. And so, that huge body had taken the form of an endless mountain range. Many ancient demon beasts were living on top of that mountain. They were surviving with the support of this giant creature's corpse. Moreover, its blood essence had already condensed into crystal stones. It's such a giant creature. It shouldn't be in hibernation, right? The third prince asked skeptically. He had swept out his divine sense. However, he could still feel its looming coercion. Moreover, its corpse didn't seem to have decayed. In fact, it still looked vivid and alive. His entire body stretched tightly. He was afraid that the awakening of this giant creature would lead to a terrible battle. One must know that this wasn't his assumption. Instead, it was possibly a disaster waiting to happen. In fact, it wasn't impossible by any means. These mega-sized creatures were different from the human race. After all, the human race had a short lifespan. However, some inborn giant creatures were similar to dragon race and so on. They had a lifespan of several thousand years. And such great lifespans meant that their life was simply endless. They could live for way too long before they died. They possessed outstanding innate talent and noble bloodline. So, they could reach to a very profound realm during the innumerable years of their lives, even if they didn't practice. On the contrary, the human race had to work hard and cultivate with their entire strength in order to obtain a very long lifespan. One could even say that these giant creatures were the true heaven's favored ones. Sleeping was a very good way to kill endless time. The human race had to strive to cultivate in order to reach to a particular realm. However, these creatures could automatically arrive at that realm by taking a nap. Anyone would become incomparably jealous by looking at such natural talent. This could also be the case with this colossus. After all, it might have become a mountain range after being in hibernation for thousands of years. Therefore, it would be a dreadful disaster if this giant creature was to be woken up. He's already dead. Sheng Feiyue concluded. He had relaxed after he had confirmed that this colossus was dead. After all, he had also been afraid of what could have happened if this creature was suddenly awakened. There's a huge empty wound on its head. Everyone looked in the direction in which Sheng Feiyue had pointed his finger. Everyone then saw a huge hole at the peak of this huge mountain range. Streams of red water were splashing out of it from time to time. Everyone held their breath. It wasn't clear when this colossus had died. However, it was still bleeding. Moreover, it didn't seem like its body had decayed. So, it was evident that this colossus must have been very powerful. However, the thing that had alarmed him even more was the fact that such a formidable colossus had been killed by someone in one stroke. He could guess that this colossus hadn't even been able to fight back. Therefore, it was possible that it may have died in one shot. Moreover, there weren't any traces of superficial scars on its body either. That person must have been insanely powerful. This is a star colossus. Yi Shiwen had recognized it in a second. There was a faintly looming star power around it. So, it was obviously a star colossus. What else could it have been? Most importantly, it hailed from the tribe of that star colossus that was sealed inside his heavenly source mirror. Star colossuses had many tribes. It wasn't that they were a single race. However, they usually kept to themselves. They would rarely come together. Yi Shiwen entered the heavenly source mirror as he realized this. That star colossus had already become motionless in the blood pool. After all, it wasn't its real body, it was only a wisp of its soul. Therefore, there was no power left inside it since Yi Shiwen had unceasingly been extracting its power. Yi Zaiwen's blood slave was quietly waiting on the other side. This blood slave had unconsciously made the breakthrough to the peak of the sage realm. The power that had been extracted from the body of the star colossus had been entirely absorbed by the blood slave. Therefore, the blood slave had promoted at a brisk pace, while the star colossus had become more and more dispirited. This star colossus was at half-step great sage realm. However, it still didn't have any way while facing the unending extraction of its vitality. It hadn't anticipated that it would fall into Yi Zaiwen's hand when it was plotting against him. After all, Yi Shiwen hadn't even reached the semi-sage realm at that time. In fact, he had merely been at the half-step legendary realm. Yi Shiwen would have a half-step great sage realm helper by his side by the time this star colossus' entire vitality was absorbed by the blood slave. And nobody below the great sage realm would be able to deal with him when that happens. Yi Shiwen, you'll die a dog's death, the star colossus roared as soon as Yi Shiwen came inside. But he had long been weak. The chains of the talisman that had shackled his body were still absorbing his vitality. Die miserably? Why you would have been in this situation if you hadn't plotted against me? Yi Shiwen smirked. He had anticipated that he had no way to destroy the magic seed inside his body because of this star colossus. He had surely put his entire effort into suppressing it. However, the magic seed was still gradually maturing, and it could pose a huge threat to him one day. In fact, it wouldn't be pretty if he were to die under the influence of the magic seed. Practicing Heart Seed Devil method was like dying 10 times without getting birth again. It was a method used for controlling other people. Yi Shiwen had that magic seed planted inside his body, and he had been surviving it so far. However, it was like a sharp sword that was hanging above his head, and it could fall at any time. In fact, it wasn't even known when it would fall. However, it would certainly be a dead end if it fell. He could only improve his cultivation in order to suppress the growth of the magic seed. He would get an opportunity to live on if this magic seed broke. Moreover, his martial power would increase drastically if that were to happen. However, he would die miserably if he couldn't survive it. However, he didn't have any other choice at this time. That thing lying over there should be from your race. Yi Shiwen loosened the star colossus seal so that it could see outside. How's this possible? The star colossus couldn't believe its eyes. However, it hadn't mistaken that familiar aura. They were similar star colossuses. However, they hadn't met frequently. In fact, they might not have seen anyone of their race in their entire lifetime. However, that wound was even more frightening. It seemed as if someone had attacked from the sky with a spear and had nailed it to death. It was hard to express in words how ferocious the killer would have been. Haha, God is really helping me. The corpse of such a colossus is infinitely precious. Haha, it seems that God has destined me, Sheng Feiyue, to rise to the peak. Sheng Feiyue's eyes suddenly glittered as he glanced over it. He wouldn't have dared to provoke a living colossus. However, a dead one couldn't pose any threat to him. On the contrary, it was a huge treasure for him. Sheng Feiyue immediately drove the flying fire meteor down. However, several hundred giant apes suddenly jumped out from the endless forest that was on that mountain range before they could land on it. Their entire bodies were emitting silver rays of light, and their faces looked fierce. Many exceptionally vicious Sage Realm apes were also present among these huge apes. Most of them had already arrived in front of these people and had launched attacks with their fists. Moreover, their fist technique looked smooth. In fact, their fists even issued whistling sounds. These giant apes have already become sentient. Their fist technique is so smooth and relaxed. It isn't inferior to that of the great masters of human race who've been immersed in practicing fist techniques for many years. Yi Shiwen remarked, "Where have they learnt this from? Is it their innate magical skill?" Martial arts cultivators used to focus on a particular martial heritage. Those who didn't have any dedicated heritage were called random cultivators with no background. People often wouldn't pay attention to such people because it was quite difficult to become powerful if one didn't have a heritage. However, where had these silver giant apes learnt this fist technique from? Is it because they are related to the bloodline of this star colossus? Yi Shiwen secretly guessed. The demon beasts on this mountain were perhaps born with the bloodline of this star colossus. They were visibly different from the ordinary demon beasts. In fact, this case was similar to how the star beasts in the foreign battlefield had taken birth with the bloodline of that sealed star colossus. These giant apes rushed forward. Consecrates of a few princes didn't even get the time to react, and were killed by the fist attacks of the giant apes. Audacious evil beasts. Sheng Feiyue finally moved into action. His entire energy soared into the sky. He didn't say anything else as he stretched out a big hand. A blue light suddenly spread across the entire sky. and the blue light that had emitted from his palm formed a huge net in the sky. The swift giant apes that were approaching at fast speed bumped into that huge net and got pierced by the blue lights. They screamed and fell down from the sky. Sheng Feiyue had displayed the true might of the sage small perfection realm. A silver giant ape suddenly roared at this time. It came out flying from inside the mountain. This silver giant ape was nearly twice as tall as the other giant apes. It launched a long-range raid. It seemed as if a small mountain was rolling over with loud bangs. Many stars were revolving around it. They were a representation of its star power. Its imposing aura was earth-shattering. After all, it was a demon beast of sage small perfection realm. It was the leader of these silver giant apes. And it was very powerful. This leader of the silver giant apes suddenly roared loudly, and the noise shook the sky. The silver star power on its body looked incredible. It issued tyrannical aura as its fist swept out toward Sheng Feiyue. In fact, the sounds of its bellows were similar to that of a devil god. The space was shattered into pieces by the fist's pressure. Rumble! Sheng Feiyue clashed with the leader of silver giant apes. And the result was earth-shattering. The remaining experts of the Great Wei Empire also began to fight with those other silver giant apes. Now is my chance. Yi Zaiwen's eyes lit up. He fluttered his golden wings. He took a detour towards the back of the mountain and landed there. Chapter 520. The front side of this mountain range had already been damaged very severely. However, these cracks on the mountain range were only constricted to the range of a dozen kilometers. They hadn't continued to proliferate any further. In fact, it seemed that a mysterious force was constricting the cracks from proliferating. This was the work of the principle of this star colossus. It that had automatically protected its body. This incredible star colossus still possessed amazing power even though it had been dead for countless years. Yi Shiwen swept his gaze. There weren't any other creatures present on top of this mountain. Only the star beasts that had born with the bloodline of this star colossus were present on the mountain. Other ancient demon beasts couldn't come near this mountain. They had been repelled by that inexplicable coercion. Yi Shiwen had barely approached the mountain range when he felt an overwhelming suppressive force pressing down upon him. His golden divinities automatically covered his entire body as a result, and resisted that huge suppressive force. Yi Shiwen walked on the mountain and arrived at that huge wound. Small pools of blood were flowing inside the wound at all times. Yi Shiwen jumped inside the wound. This was an extremely long passage. He could even feel that this star colossus body still had the vitality. It didn't seem that it had died several years ago. Its ferocious body would have made it extremely difficult to kill it if its mind hadn't been extinguished by that strike. Its blood still contained huge amounts of energy. It wasn't surprising that those silver giant apes possessed extraordinary strength. Yi Shiwen went ahead walking along that huge wound. He could still hear the thumping heartbeats that were transmitting the blood in all parts of its body. Yi Shiwen transformed into a golden streamer and flew inside the body of this star colossus. He saw a planet inside its body some time later. It was revolving, and a section of universe had taken shape around it. This was a piece of universe. This star colossus had actually quenched a planet inside its inner core. And it had used the star power from that planet as the driving force for its own body. No wonder that these star colossuses were so powerful that it was hard to find a match for them. The true Martial University had been compelled to collapse by a star colossus in its most prosperous times. However, this star colossus' vitality hadn't gone down after its death. That's because its soul had been annihilated, but the star core was still preserved. Therefore, this huge body hadn't decayed since it had been supported by a steady stream of star power. After all, this star colossus wasn't immortal in reality. Its body had only appeared immortal for countless years because of this nucleus that was unceasingly producing star power. It's hard to imagine the strength of the man who killed this huge monster. Yi Shiwen had no choice but to admire. This world had many people whose strength was beyond his very comprehension. However, he became excited soon after. He had always been worried about his future progress because he had started his journey late when compared to his peers. After all, that kid Pang Yongbo had become a Heaven's Pride expert and had advanced to the semi-sage realm at the age of 10 years. However, Yi Shiwen had merely entered the Hotian realm when he was 11 or 12 years old. He had surely put his entire effort to reduce this disparity in the future. And his cultivation realm had also advanced quite quickly. However, there had been a big disparity from the beginning. And he couldn't ignore this disparity anyhow. He needed to advance quicker than those other Heaven's Pride experts in order to catch up. However, this would undoubtedly make his foundation unstable. This wasn't a joke. What would be the long-term prospect of a tall building with an unstable foundation? It might collapse at any time. He knew about this matter more than anyone else, since it was more important to him than it was to others. Therefore, he had always attached special importance to this matter. He had always made the preparations before he would make a breakthrough. He would obviously do this to make his foundation safer and better. However, it required the support of countless spirit energies. The realm was like the blueprint of a tall building. He could deduce it with the help of his mysterious space. However, he couldn't construct the building without the help of the raw materials. He had nearly consumed the resources he had obtained by winning the 4-sex martial arts competition. And now this huge star core had fallen upon him like an enormous pie. Moreover, it was much easier to absorb it than the primary spirit dawn. Yi Shiwen didn't hesitate. He promptly laid out a barrier formation inside the body of this colossus. After that, he began his closed-door training. He put his entire effort and didn't stop for even a bit. The observing person scripture was operating crazily. It didn't stop for even a moment. The small universe in his body was also revolving frantically. The star core issued buzzing sound like a spinning cocoon since its star power was being extracted little by little. It was obviously being absorbed by Yi Zaiwen's body. This endless star power was a big supplement for him. He didn't even need to convert this energy. He must obtain the support of more and more star power if he wanted to expand the universe that was inside his body. The star power gradually entered his small universe. His small universe had also begun to expand inch by inch. Yi Zaiwen's small solar system had taken shape after he had entered the Sage realm. It could now function independently. In fact, it could even produce star power which could further expand his universe. However, its speed was very slow. In fact, forming a proper universe still looked far-fetched. He would need to draw support from this solar system for several hundred years or 1,000 years, or even more than that to make that happen. However, this star core had enormously accelerated this process. He gradually reached closer to making the breakthrough under the influence of the surging star power. He looked like a real god sitting upright in the universe and chanting sutras from ancient scriptures. He was sitting upright under the enlightening mind ancient tree. The enlightening mind ancient tree was glowing silver under the shower of the star power. It gradually drooped upon his body and shrouded it in its entirety. A page of the ancient scripture emitted a dazzling golden beam above Yi Zaiwen's head. It seemed like this chant had existed since ancient times. Yi Shiwen knew that time was running out. Sheng Feiyue might defeat those star beasts anytime. And then he would rush inside as well. Therefore, Yi Shiwen needed to make the breakthrough before Sheng Feiyue arrived here. Else, he would have no other choice but to escape in distress. He had decided to use all his methods in order to make the breakthrough within a short time. He had taken out the enlightening mind ancient tree, and had also used that page of the ancient god scripture along with it. This page of ancient god scripture wasn't some incredible secret method or anything. However, it was like the most profound recorded principle in the world. He would gain some benefits every time he'd read it. And this resulted in a long-term gain. It might seem like he hadn't made a huge progress if one were to look after a short period of time. However, the accumulation over a long period of time would eventually turn into a very big profit. The fifth god's cultivation speed had been very quick. And this page of ancient god scripture had played a big role in that. You beasts are acting very recklessly. Sheng Feiyue repelled an attack from the leader of those silver giant apes. I know your intelligence isn't inferior to that of humans. You should have surrendered to me earlier, and I would have spared all you mountain spirit beasts in return. However, you are following the path of your own doom now. So, I will kill all of you at once." Sheng Feiyue had become somewhat impatient. He would have spared the lives of these silver giant apes if they had surrendered in the beginning, and he would have made them his slaves after that. However, he had already lost his patience by now. The dead body of this unknown colossus had attracted his desire beyond any known limits. So, he couldn't wait anymore. "Arrogant human," the leader of the silver giant apes roared. An invisible force suddenly rushed out from the top of its head. It seemed as if a godly ape was standing between the heaven and the earth. It felt as if its domineering presence could scare the gods and devil into submission. "Someone like you doesn't stand a chance." Sheng Feiyue sneered. A dreadful magical power suddenly pressed down from above. A palace suddenly appeared from the void. It issued waves of sage power as it fell down from the sky. It was a sage tool in reality. Sheng Feiyue had condensed the palace where he lived into a sage tool. It possessed endless might and could be transported anywhere and anytime via a portal. Rumble! The palace grew bigger and bigger as it swept towards that giant ape leader to crush it. The entire world broke down into pieces. Cracks appeared in the space as if it was a mirror. They then proliferated across the entire horizon like a spider web. The legs of that leader of the silver giant apes suddenly broke down, and it fell to its knees. Its martial power was far inferior to that of a Heaven's Pride expert like Sheng Feiyue who had been practicing since several hundred years. Moreover, Sheng Feiyue's strength had increased very greatly since he had taken out a sage tool. Beasts will always be beasts. I had given you a chance to live, but you didn't take that. A sinister look appeared on Sheng Feiyue's face. Endless divine beams emitted from the palm of his big hand. The divine beams got interweaved, formed a huge net of light, and advanced towards that leader of the silver giant apes to shroud and crush it. Bang! That leader of the silver giant apes was trapped by the large light net of Sheng Feiyue's. It then exploded in the sky and transformed into a mass of blood fog. The other silver giant apes scattered in panic when they saw that their leader had been killed. However, how could they have escaped from the hands of Sheng Feiyue? They were annihilated one by one. Sheng Feiyue jumped onto the mountain after he had killed those silver giant apes. He faced upwards and burst into laughter. "Ha ha ha, God is favoring me. This colossus obviously has an extraordinary origin. Even its dead body is an astronomical wealth. Ha ha ha. Congratulations, senior brother Sheng. You will become invincible throughout all the generations." The other princes and their subordinates clapped for Sheng Feiyue and praised him in flattery. They enjoyed a noble status in the Great Wei state. However, they knew that they were nothing in front of Sheng Feiyue. The Great Wei state undoubtedly possessed outstanding national strength. However, even dozens of such Great Wei states were nothing in front of the meteor sect. These people could act domineeringly in the Great Wei state. However, they were nothing when it came to the bigger picture of the meteor world. In fact, they were far inferior to Meteor Sect's powerful core disciple like Sheng Feiyue. They could only fawn over him when in his presence. Rumble! Sheng Feiyue was still feeling pleased with himself when the energy of the entire world suddenly congealed together. Countless spirit energies suddenly came whistling towards the mountain range. Then, a powerful aura erupted from the mountain. Sheng Feiyue's complexion had darkened. Someone had beaten him to a punch. Chapter 521. Sheng Feiyue saw this and became angry. He had realized that someone had taken advantage of the distraction his fight had created, and this person had then drilled their way inside. Damn it! This opportunistic son of a bitch has dared to take advantage of the distraction to go inside. Sheng Feiyue roared. He stretched his big hand, and it emitted endless rays of light. They then transformed into a big net of light and swept down. Bang! The entire mountain suddenly collapsed under the attack of this huge net. It seemed as if the sky had fallen down to the ground and had shattered into small pieces within a split second. Subsequently, the rubble from the mountain was reduced to powder. Then, waves of strong astral winds set off and dispersed these dusts. Bang! A golden real elemental energy appeared from below and soared into the sky. A violent turbulence surged up and around, and a slim figure appeared along with it. He was dressed in blue clothes. His eyes looked profound, and his aura felt formidable. In fact, it seemed as if an ancient devil god had reincarnated. The golden divinities were boiling on Yi Zaiwen's entire body. An exceptional fighting intention was overflowing from his body. "Who are you?" Sheng Feiyu's ice-cold eyes flickered indefinitely. He had roared these words out loudly. He had also felt that the energy of this man who stood before his eyes was boiling ferociously. Yi Shiwen grinned and replied, "Weren't you the one who was looking for me? Don't you wish to kill me? You are that so-called dragon master?" The second prince became bewildered when he looked into Yi Shiwen's eyes. He hadn't expected that the person they had been searching would appear in front of them in such a manner. Moreover, he was shocked to see that this man was much younger than he had expected. Martial arts experts could maintain their youthful appearance. However, Yi Shiwen wasn't a several hundred or thousand years old expert who had maintained his young appearance. Instead, he was very young. He looked 50 years old at most. How was it possible for such a young man to become a great master of alchemy? However, it must be true. Otherwise, Jiang Zhouqing would never have gone to meet him personally. Jiang Zhouqing had been practicing since several hundred years. Yet, even he couldn't surpass this dragon master. "You are a liar. Isn't that right? You are a liar because you claim that you are a great master of alchemy. You wanted to sneak into our Great Wei Empire, right? What's your objective?" The third prince exclaimed in anger when he saw Yi Zaiwen's real face for the first time. "Humph! Where do you come from? You have dared to infiltrate the forces of our meteor sect. You have bad intentions. Wait and watch how I crack down on you and find out about your secrets." Sheng Feiyue sneered. His eyes didn't flicker anymore. His terrifying aura rushed out like an overwhelming vast ocean in order to suppress Yi Zaiwen's soul. "I didn't know where to look for you. However, I didn't know that you yourself would appear in front of me. The time spent on trying to find you here, and there didn't go in vain after all." Sheng Feiyue was at Sage Small Perfection Realm. He was leaps and bounds ahead of the Sage Peak Realm. Earlier, Yi Shiwen would have been no match for Sheng Feiyue even if his fighting strength had been strong enough to rival that of the experts of the Sage Peak Realm. Not to mention that Sheng Feiyue was considered a very tyrannical expert even in the Sage Small Perfection Realm. "It doesn't matter what your background is. You have dared to take advantage of me. You are courting death." Sheng Feiyue shouted. His murderous aura surged up. He was a bit wary of Yi Shiwen at first. However, he didn't let that bother him for long. He belonged to a prestigious family, and he was a heaven's pride expert of his generation. Also, he had been unceasingly obtaining resources from the meteor sect. So, he wasn't worried about a random cultivator with no background even if the said expert also had good qualifications. The contest between a random cultivator with no background and an expert of a legitimate sect would be one-sided even if they were to be in the same realm. Their access to resources, spirit stones, divine tools, power techniques, and so on just weren't on same level. Sheng Feiyue extended his big hand. Endless rays of light suddenly burst from it and swept out towards Yi Shiwen to crush him. But Yi Shiwen wasn't going to be outdone. Golden divine beams had covered his entire body. In fact, it seemed as if Sheng Feiyue was fighting against a golden statue. Bang! The fight had reached a superheated stage in no time, and both sides had started resorting to extreme methods. The entire space had shattered into pieces under their attacks. Their battle had reached to the sky. Those experts of the Great Wei Empire turned pale with fright. They were visibly surprised by Yi Zaiwen's strength. All of them were familiar with Sheng Feiyu's strength. He had merely been practicing for 300 years, but he had already entered the Sage Small Perfection realm. He was a heaven's pride expert of his generation. And there was almost no doubt that he would advance to Great Sage realm in the future. He possessed incredible strength. That leader beast of Sage Small Perfection realm had also been slaughtered by him a moment ago. So, they had seen the extent of Sheng Feiyu's strength. The ape leader was also in Sage Small Perfection realm. Still, there had been a difference of cloud and mud between their strengths. Sheng Feiyu's strength was so tyrannical that it was difficult to find a match for him among his peers. Perhaps, only those top Heaven's Pride experts could overshadow him. They had thought that Yi Shiwen would only have the strength of the Sage Peak realm at most. However, it didn't seem like he was in a disadvantageous position while fighting with Sheng Feiyue. And this had left them in extreme shock. I didn't expect you to have some means of your own. However, that's also useless. After all, what are you in comparison to our meteor sect? Sheng Feiyue hadn't obtained the upper hand over Yi Shiwen yet. And this had surprised him. He would have understood if Yi Shiwen had been in the Sage Small Perfection realm. However, he didn't seem to be. In fact, he appeared to be in the intermediate stage of Sage realm. But Yi Shiwen had still managed to match him until now. And this had surpassed Sheng Feiyu's imagination by far. Yi Shiwen slightly raised the corner of his mouth. His fighting strength had made a huge progress after he had made the breakthrough into the intermediate stage of Sage realm. He couldn't have dealt with Sheng Feiyue so easily if he had still been in the initial stage of Sage realm. In fact, he would have been in a very difficult situation. He would have had to retreat instead. After all, his realm differed by a lot from that of Sheng Feiyu's. Sheng Feiyue had started operating the green rainbow meteor cultivation method inside his body. This was a very tyrannical power technique of the meteor sect. This technique had emerged out of the meteor sect's name. A starry white light was emanating from his entire body. He was attacking with his entire strength and wasn't holding back. "They'll send you on your way to hell." Sheng Feiyue flashed an evil grin. He brandished his palm. This was the meteor sect's technique, Thousand Stars Tyrant Palm. Only a few people in the meteor sect knew this palm technique. In fact, most of the core disciples hadn't even gotten the opportunity to learn this technique. However, Sheng Feiyue had gotten this opportunity because he was a core disciple and a Heaven's Pride expert. This was enough to determine how praiseworthy this palm technique was. That palm slapped through the clouds that hung from the sky and broke down the entire blue dome of heaven. The killing intention was clearly overflowing to the heavens. However, he was surprised to see Yi Shiwen smiling in the face of this attack. Yi Shiwen suddenly raised the corner of his mouth and brandished his palm. However, it wasn't the fire clouds falling sky hand this time. Rather, it was the Thousand Stars Tyrant Palm. Moreover, Yi Shiwen's hands had somehow displayed it in its truest form. It wasn't entirely in its purest form, so to say. However, it looked more tyrannical than the attack that had been launched by Sheng Feiyue. This was because of the star power in Yi Shiwen's body. Bang! The two big hands suddenly collided in the sky. Countless shadows of those two palms filled the entire sky. And it seemed as if these palm shadows were ripping the vast sky apart. The world shook and collapsed under their attacks. The murderous energy flew from the sky and surged all over. The scene appeared similar to the Judgment Day. It seemed as if cold water had been poured onto those princes and other people of the Great Wei Empire. Chills ran down their spines. They looked insignificant in front of this level of fighting power. They could only acquire the position of the Emperor of Great Wei Empire. However, they were undoubtedly insignificant in front of these genuine young elites. Only a colossal force like the Meteor Sect could have nurtured such young elites. Indeed, there were other people that had such exceptional innate talent. However, other people used to get a pitiful amount of resources when compared to the disciples of these big sections. A good amount of resources was the so-called basic requirement for effective cultivation. In fact, it was considered a joke if someone wanted to make the breakthroughs without having the unceasing support of these resources. How is it possible? A look of fright flashed on Sheng Feiyu's face. He wasn't shocked because Yi Shiwen was able to contend against him. Instead, it was because Yi Shiwen had used the Thousand Stars Tyrant Palm technique. After all, this was the Meteor Sect's secret technique. Are you also a disciple of the Meteor Sect? It's impossible. Could Yi Shiwen also be a disciple of the Meteor Sect? He had never seen Yi Shiwen. But then again, The meteor sect had several million disciples. How could he recognize all of them? However, another thought crossed his mind. It would have been normal if he hadn't heard about an ordinary person. But Yi Shiwen wasn't ordinary. He had a very high cultivation level at a very young age. So, how come he had never heard of him? He didn't believe that Yi Shiwen could be a hidden cultivator or whatnot. A chicken is a chicken, and a phoenix is a phoenix. A chicken can't be compared with a phoenix even if a phoenix has met with a misfortune. Only the cultivation of a person is the factor that can decide whether they are a chicken or a phoenix. A phoenix will always be a phoenix. A phoenix will stand out even if they have sunk into a group of chickens. Their shine won't get concealed. Could he be some elder's foreign disciple? This wasn't impossible. After all, the meteor sect had so many elders, and many of them were eccentric. They would teach top-secret techniques to outsiders because they considered it to be their predestined affinity. The so-called immortal fate is beyond everything. And Yi Ziwen's Thousand Stars Tyrant Palm technique also seemed somewhat unfamiliar. Therefore, this ought to be the case. Of course, Sheng Feiyue would never get to know the real reason why Yi Ziwen's Thousand Stars Tyrant Palm technique looked strange. It wasn't because he hadn't learned it properly. And it wasn't because he had misinterpreted some vital concept while learning it from a copy of a secret martial arts book that was left behind by some master. Instead, it was because Yi Shiwen had used the Thousand Stars Tyrant Palm technique for the first time in his life. He had certainly used the mysterious space in that split second to deduce the mysteries of the Thousand Stars Tyrant Palm technique. However, it would obviously look a bit strange since he had used it for the first time. So, this out of his hands. Meteor sect? I am not. Yi Shiwen grinned. His snow-white teeth somewhat horrified the people. It's over. Yi Shiwen spoke up. The killing intention flashed in his eyes. Yi Shiwen had never shown any leniency in killing his enemies. A tooth for a tooth, and an eye for an eye was his motto. If someone wanted to fight with him, he would certainly do that. And if someone wanted to kill him, he would certainly kill that person. It was that simple. The news of this mustn't spread outside. It would cause a huge uproar, whether it was about the involvement of Great Wei Empire or about the corpse of the Star Colossus. The Great Wei Empire wasn't a very big empire for the meteor sect. However, this matter concerned meteor sect. And they wouldn't allow other people to interfere. In fact, they would become extremely enraged if they found out about the things that were going on here. And he reckoned that he would be chased by a group of great sage experts if the news of the corpse of the Star Colossus got out. Yi Shiwen knew that he must not leave any clue. Chapter 522. This was a very realistic problem. The so-called killing people and preventing them from divulging a secret was so. Yi Shiwen would certainly die if they didn't die. He might escape if one great sage expert were to chase him. However, what about a group of great sage experts? How would he escape then? Also, these people wanted to kill him as well. Therefore, letting them live could prove to be even more troublesome for him. Yi Shiwen deliberated for a while. He then decided to put away the Thousand Stars Tyrant Palm. He had obtained this palm technique from the blood-red-clothed young master. However, he had never used it. In fact, he hadn't even practiced it. Right now, he wanted to annihilate these people in the shortest span of time. Otherwise, some formidable ancient demon beasts might arrive here. And that would be too bad. One mustn't forget that each of these beasts possessed extraordinary spiritual intelligence. This spiritual intelligence wasn't inferior to the intelligence of an ordinary human. Moreover, many of them had been alive since thousands of years, and were simply old foxes. So, why wouldn't they have any interest in the treasures that were present here? Yi Shiwen attacked without any hesitation after he thought of this. His entire body transformed into a universe. This was a universe that had existed since eternity, a universe that was spread everywhere, an eternal universe. The so-called eternal universe was the collection of space and time. And only God could control space and time. Yi Ziwen's universe was continuously growing. In fact, There would come a day when he would have so much power that he would be able to control the entirety of time and space. And nobody would be able to do him any harm when that would happen. He hadn't become that terrifying at present. However, faint signs of it were present. His universe would transform into a realm one day. However, this was a matter for the future. Yi Ziwen's fist suddenly pressed down like a huge star. It carried terrifying momentum. In fact, it seemed like a boundless galaxy as it swept down on Sheng Feiyue to crush him. Yi Shiwen had attacked with all of his strength. This was the first time that he had attacked with his entire strength ever since he had made the breakthrough into the intermediate stage of Sage Realm. So, this attack was entirely different from the ones that he had performed when he was in the initial stage of Sage Realm. After all, he had made a substantial progress. Yi Ziwen's ferocious aura arrived over Sheng Feiyue's head and overwhelmed him completely. It looked incredible. Sheng Feiyue had started his journey many years ago, and he had become a famous Heaven's Pride expert in a very short span of time after he had entered the Meteor sect. However, the Meteor world and the true martial world were different. The true martial world had changed into a place where independent warlords used to compete for the power that had been vacated with the decline of the true martial university. However, the Meteor sect was still in its flourishing period. The Meteor sect alone was the largest force. Therefore, there weren't many competitions taking place in the Meteor sect. The Heaven's Pride experts were particularly considered to be isolated, and they weren't allowed to compete with each other, at least not until they had reached the Sage Realm. Therefore, Sheng Feiyue had never fought with the Heaven's Pride experts of his generation, let alone with a person like Yi Shiwen who had taken the lives of many Heaven's Pride experts. He may have been engaged in the occasional fights, but he had never been beaten down before. Moreover, Yi Shiwen was much younger than him. Yi Shiwen used his entire strength and didn't hold back one bit. The Big Bang Stardust fist rushed through several hundred miles. It smashed the void into pieces wherever it went, and the chaos was unleashed from the other side. Then, this startling attack suddenly materialized in front of Sheng Feiyue. Bang! Sheng Feiyue's Thousand Stars tyrant palm got crushed in an instant. The starlight that had spread across the entire sky also vanished. Instead, Yi Ziwen's fist exploded like the Big Bang. Crack crack! The horrifying sound of breaking of bones could be heard. Sheng Feiyue's hands had gotten crushed. After that, his body entered the spatial fault. The space broke down and he sank into it. His entire body had been drenched in blood. He was in a tragic state. The scene looked too horrible. Senior brother Sheng has sustained injuries? Those people of the imperial clan of the Great Wei State were left dumbstruck as they saw this scene. Sheng Feiyue was a godlike figure to them. However, he had been seriously injured by this Dragon Master. He was considered among the top-notch Heaven's Pride experts of the Meteor sect. However, he was left powerless and unable to fight back. It seemed as if they had been brought back to their senses by the sound of a loud and ear-piercing thunderclap. However, the power of Yi Ziwen's fist didn't decrease. It swept down and struck Sheng Feiyue's main body. His bones began to issue gurgle sound under the ferocious pressure, and blood gushed out from his entire body. Sheng Feiyue was struggling with all his strength. His body had begun to transform into flames under the starlight. He looked like a burning fireball, like a star that had illuminated the eternal universe. These burning flames began to burn Yi Ziwen's fist. This produced a noise. It wasn't clear how hot those flames were. However, they looked exceptionally ferocious. Yi Shiwen laughed loudly. "You think this will work?" An ordinary person would have gotten burnt to death by these terrifying flames. This was also one of the hidden cards of Sheng Feiyue's. However, Yi Shiwen had practiced the Tyrant Body technique till the 7th layer. In fact, he could even contend against a sage tool with his bare hands. So, one could imagine how ferocious his body had become. Therefore, it was impossible for him to be defeated by such a counterattack. Bang! Yi Ziwen's fist had transformed into a huge star, and it refused to bow under the impact of this counterattack. Instead, his fist pounded even more quickly. Those princes and other experts felt as if two stars had suddenly collided in a boundless universe. The world had collapsed, and everyone had been left to tremble with fear. Ah! Sheng Feiyue screamed. He appeared to be in an exceptionally dire situation. Yi Ziwen's ferocious fist had already crushed his entire body. His flesh had also begun to tear apart, and his thick bones had become exposed. His blood had started to splash out as well. It was evident that he had sustained very serious injuries. He realized that he had messed with the wrong person. "I won't go down," Sheng Feiyue roared, and his voice stirred the horizon. However, Yi Shiwen didn't show any mercy as his mountain-like fist slammed down on Sheng Feiyue. Rumble! Sheng Feiyue's bones got shattered, and more of his blood splashed out. It looked terrible. His internal organs had been destroyed, and his soul was also annihilated. Yi Shiwen searched for Sheng Feiyue's storage ring. Sheng Feiyue was extremely rich when compared to a troubled person like Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen alternated between being rich and poor. He swept in his divine sense and found an abundance of wealth inside Sheng Feiyue's stock. The amount of primary spirit dawn was alone more than 30 million. And the total wealth surpassed 100 million after the value of the various other treasures were added to it. It could be said that Sheng Feiyue had been far wealthier than ordinary sage experts. Of course, even this wealth of 100 million might not be enough for a spendthrift like Yi Shiwen. You dared to kill him." The third prince was shocked. His heart sank as he realized that Sheng Feiyue had been killed. "It seems like I did," Yi Shiwen replied in a carefree manner. He was standing in the sky, and he was looking down at everyone like they were already dead. That's right. He was looking at a group of dead people. It seemed as if Yi Shiwen was looking into their eyes. A chill ran down the second prince's spine. He had suddenly realized that Yi Shiwen could kill all of them. "You want to kill us?" the second prince spoke up. His complexion had changed very significantly since he couldn't stop himself from getting scared this time. He knew that Yi Shiwen would kill all of them in order to preserve the secret of this place. Otherwise, the secret of this place would certainly leak out. Quickly! The third prince shouted. He transformed into a streamer of light and promptly flew in one direction. Everyone else also flew away in different directions in quick succession. He believed that Yi Shiwen wouldn't be able to kill all of them if they escaped in different directions. And he was obviously hoping that he would be able to escape while Yi Shiwen was killing the other people. Humph! Yi Shiwen snorted. The spirit energies began to condense frantically in the air. Then, a super-huge wave condensed and swept out. It then condensed into a great seal that filled the sky. And the inverting ocean seal suddenly swept down. Bang! A huge explosion occurred. A vast space got smashed to pieces. The chaos leaked out from the cracks in the space and overflowed the entire sky. Bang! Those people wanted to escape. However, it was impossible for them to match Yi Ziwen's speed. Yi Shiwen had destroyed them in a split second. Overturning the heaven's seal was a wonderful ancient technique. One could even overturn the blue dome of heaven if one practiced this technique to the peak. Yi Shiwen practiced this technique all the time. However, he had grasped it only recently. In fact, he hadn't even practiced the inverting ocean seal to the peak. So, it wasn't clear when he would grasp the overturning the heavens seal. Let alone practice it to the pinnacle. Yi Shiwen wiped clean the traces after he had annihilated these people. He then conveniently collected the dead body of the massive star colossus. This star colossus was enormous. So, it was very difficult for Yi Shiwen to collect it and put it inside, even though it was dead. Fortunately, he had the heavenly source mirror. So, he placed the star colossus inside the heavenly source mirror. An ordinary spatial ring or some other space-type divine tool would have broken down if it had been used in place of the heavenly source mirror. Yi Shiwen had only consumed a little bit of this star colossus star core in order to make the breakthrough to the intermediate stage of Sage Realm. After that, Yi Shiwen started to play with Sheng Feiyue's divine tool palace. He could only sigh at this huge world since it was full of extraordinary wonders. Someone had actually made a sage tool out of a palace. Moreover, it could attack as well as defend. Such a divine tool was extremely rare. In fact, it was rarer than those inner divine armors and those other defensive divine tools. However, this wasn't enough to tempt Yi Shiwen. After all, Yi Mo was undoubtedly more important to him than these rare divine tools. Yi Shiwen would gamble everything if it meant waking up Yi Mo from his slumber. Not to mention that Yi Mo had become like this for his sake. In fact, Yi Shiwen would have long become a cold corpse if Yi Mo hadn't saved him. Yi Shiwen had realized that this star colossus was a treasure house of herbs. Its corpse was like an incomparably huge stockpile of resources. He had only absorbed a little bit of the star core, and even that had been enough for him to make the breakthrough into the intermediate stage of Sage Realm. Therefore, Yi Mo would surely get well soon if he swallowed this entire colossus. Yi Shiwen cast a spell to wake up Yi Mo when this thought crossed his mind. Yi Shiwen could take the initiative to wake up Yi Mo, thanks to the growing number of sage tools which Yi Mo had swallowed. Yi Shiwen no longer needed to wait for him to wake up on his own. However, Yi Shiwen wouldn't have wanted to wake him up as soon as possible if it wasn't important. Chapter 523, Changes in the Last 3 Years. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. A cold wind was whistling. It had transformed into a freezing astral wind at higher altitudes. The sound of fluttering of clothes echoed in the vicinity. However, Yi Shiwen didn't seem to care as that cold wind blew against his face. In fact, he didn't even use his real elemental energy to block the wind. You are fortunate that you found a dead star colossus. Yi Mo's voice echoed inside Yi Ziwen's mind. His voice was still weak. However, his condition had improved a lot after he had swallowed that palace sage tool. Yi Shiwen nodded. He agreed with Yi Mo's point of view. After all, the true martial university's decline was enough to guess the tyranny of an adult star colossus. Such a star colossus might not appear for 10,000 years. However, it would cause an enormous calamity once it had appeared. Therefore, this was an enormous opportunity for him even though he had only obtained the dead body of a star colossus. Even the great Sage Realm experts would go crazy over it. You should be able to recover after you've swallowed the dead body of this star colossus. Yi Shiwen replied. He believed that Yi Mo would rejuvenate by using the exuberant vitality of this star colossus. Indeed, but... Yi Mo shook his head and said, "This is an enormous opportunity for you. And it could give you a huge boost. So, it would be extremely unfortunate if I swallowed it." "What are you saying?" Yi Shiwen asked. "This star colossus belongs to the same race as the one that is sealed in the true martial world. But this one is merely an infant." Yi Mo's words left Yi Shiwen speechless. This star colossus had been so dreadful at infancy. So, one couldn't even imagine how dreadful an adult star colossus might be. However, it needed to be mentioned that an adult star colossus appeared as big as a star and used to feed on planets. However, even this one's strength clearly surpasses the great Sage Realm. Moreover, the blood slave that you control can be used for controlling this star colossus. This star colossus is dead. However, only its soul has been destroyed. Its body is still the same as it was when it was alive. Moreover, I am afraid that its corpse will eventually give birth to a resentful soul if things go on like this. And that would bring an enormous disaster. Yi Mo explained. Your blood slave has also been condensed from the soul of a star colossus. It displays only a small might at present. However, it could contend against the experts of half-step Great Sage Realm if you integrate it with this star colossus' formidable body. Moreover, your blood slave will eventually enter the half-step Great Sage Realm once it has absorbed the entire soul of the star colossus that is inside the blood pond. And it will be able to contend against the great sage experts when that happens. It will provide you with an enormous amount of protection as a result. In fact, even that Mu Xingjie can't harm you if you have the protection of great sage level. Plus, I don't need it urgently. Moreover, I will recover quickly once you have the strength of great sage realm. After all, the level of strength decides whether a matter is difficult or not. A lot of problems can be solved very easily if you have enough strength. Yi Shiwen nodded. He didn't hesitate after he had heard Yi Mo's words. He first made the blood slave try and control the dead body of that star colossus. It could be said that the blood slave was doing the job here. However, Yi Ziwen's soul was connected to the blood slave. Therefore, it was no different than him doing the job. After this, a pair of huge wings appeared on his back. His wings suddenly fluttered. He transformed into a streamer and disappeared into the horizon. A Heaven's Pride expert of the meteor sect had died in the heavenly pit. This news should have caused a huge sensation. However, this news had been drowned by the other news that had proliferated from the heavenly pit. The secrets inside the heavenly pit had gradually been dug out along with the arrival of a great number of experts. Even the information about the bereaved had been excavated with the passage of time. It turned out that these ruins belonged to the bereaved Third Eye race. It was reported that the members of the Third Eye race had a third eye on their foreheads. However, the rest of their body was similar to that of humans. One such race had been present among the races which were purged by the meteor sect in the past. Therefore, this news had proliferated even more quickly. It was reported that this was the ancestral land of the Third Eye race. So, this was their foundation place. It had certainly declined. However, there should be many incredible treasures present inside. 3 years' time had passed in a flash. The bereaved were no longer part of rumors alone. Rather, there was conclusive evidence now. In fact, someone had even seen the bereaved people. And it was reported that the high-level experts of the entire meteor sect were extremely concerned because of the appearance of the bereaved. Thus, they had sent a large number of experts here. There was a city outside the heavenly pit. This city had become popular because of the heavenly pit. Hundreds of thousands of people had gathered in this city in a short time. And the majority of them were cultivators. A scholar-looking man was sitting upright on the main seat inside a lively restaurant. Many travel-worn experts had surrounded him. He faintly opened his mouth and said, "You newcomers think that you will find some treasures inside this heavenly pit. However, I will suggest you that it would be better to not provoke some people." The small Jupiter of the meteor sect is an example of such a person. His strength has already entered the half-step great sage realm. It is difficult to find a match for him in the younger generation. In fact, nobody can outmatch him apart from those old great sage experts. However, almost all the great sage experts in this meteor world belong to the meteor sect. After all, this is their territory. 1 or 2 great sage experts may occasionally arrive from outside, however, they don't dare to mess with him either. This is the reason why he has suddenly risen to fame. Of course, how can we dare to provoke the experts of the meteor sect? The small Jupiter had earned his fame long ago. It is said that he will soon enter the great sage realm. How can we provoke someone like him? Yeah, it's best that we don't mess with those people of the meteor sect. Many random cultivators with no background spoke up one after another. Offending the true martial university in the true martial world might not be a big matter. However, offending the meteor sect in the meteor world was akin to courting death. Isn't there any other ferocious expert apart from him? Someone curiously asked. They had arrived here very recently. So, they wanted to know about the situation here. 3 years had passed. However, those who wanted to fish up some gold, or who wanted some treasures, were still arriving unceasingly. Many people had died inside. And their bodies had been ravaged by the ancient demon beasts. However, there were many who had obtained a lot of benefits in the pit, and had soared to the sky after that. Therefore, this place's allure had attracted many people, and they had been arriving here unceasingly. This was probably an example of the saying seeking riches and honor amidst danger. There's another calamity star apart from the meteor sect's small Jupiter. Nobody knows his name. He usually dresses in green clothes and carries an 8 or 9 years old girl along with him. Everyone calls him the green-clothed traveler. He had become famous after a fight 2 years ago. He had once managed to escape from a great sage expert. And an expert of half-step great sage realm has also died by his hands. He is incomparably dreadful. These two are the most terrifying experts. But there's no need to worry as long as you don't run into them. Of course, you can only blame your fate if you unluckily come across the attack of a great sage expert. That scholar laughed mischievously and said. Everyone nodded. This was true. Great sage realm experts weren't the real danger here. They were certainly very powerful. However, they wouldn't move into action without any reason. After all, those old and sly foxes wouldn't move into action unless they had obtained some concrete information. Therefore, sage experts were the main powerhouses that were active inside the heavenly pit. And these two individuals were the most frightening among them. Tap, tap, tap. The sound of footsteps came from downstairs. It was gentle and in rhythm. A green shadow appeared in front of everyone along with the sound of footsteps. They were surprised to see a handsome young man dressed up in green. He didn't look very outstanding from appearance. However, he seemed aloof. There was a little girl by his side. She was dressed up in a sky blue long skirt. Her skirt also had silver embroidery on it. Her face looked delicate and pretty. Her complexion looked a bit red. Her eyebrows were slanted, and her mouth was small. A timid expression was hung on her face. She looked approximated 8 or 9 years old. Her long and silver hair was rolled up into 2 knots on the top of her head. 2 silver bangs were softly hanging down over her eyes. They were dangling in a rhythmic fashion. Silver hair. Everyone noticed that this young girl had silver hair. After all, this made her look very peculiar. However, they then noticed that the young man with her was dressed in green clothes. And they immediately remembered the green-clothed traveler that Scholar had told them about. Isn't that? Dresses in green clothes and carries a young girl along. Even that Scholar had held his breath when he had seen them arrive. He had recognized who this person was. It couldn't be anyone else. After all, only that green-clothed traveler could dare to dress up like that. It wasn't that nobody had tried to impersonate him. However, he had quickly found out about those who had done so. And then he had killed them. In fact, he had killed around a dozen imposters in a short span of time. Thus, nobody had dared to impersonate the green-clothed traveler after that. That little girl obviously became a bit timid when she saw so many people around. So, she grabbed that green-clothed traveler's big hand. However, the green-clothed traveler merely looked at the little girl with a faint smile on his face. Then, he took her to a table. Everyone held their breaths as they saw these 2 young individuals, one big and one small. They didn't dare to say anything. Yi Shiwen wasn't too surprised when he noticed that everyone had held their breaths. He merely picked up Xiaoya and made her sit on a chair. The little girl sat there in a cute manner. But she didn't say anything. Yi Shiwen ordered some dishes. The trace of a smile appeared at the corner of his mouth under the mask. He had spent these 3 years fighting. More and more people had continued to arrive since an increasing number of things had been discovered inside the heavenly pit. Moreover, it seemed that the craze for this place wouldn't quieten down in the several decades to come, or even the several hundred years after. This 3 years' time had a very big effect on him. His slightly unstable realm had consolidated and had become stable. He had also made narrow escapes many times. However, the first one had been the direst of them all. This was when the meteor sect had investigated about Xing Feiyu's death. And Yi Shiwen had attracted the meteor sect's rage because of that. Consequently, they had sent a great sage expert to kill him. He was eventually forced to merge the blood slave with that star colossus. And its fighting strength had increased very drastically as a result. This is why he was able to escape from that great sage expert. That fight had resulted in a bloodbath. Yi Shiwen had escaped after sustaining serious injuries. Moreover, a senior half-step great sage expert of the meteor sect had perished in an instance that had taken place later. He even clashed with the small Jupiter one time. And it had indeed been very terrible. However, it was time to leave. Too many changes had occurred in the last 3 years' time. For example, the Great Wei Empire had already elected a new emperor. Chapter 524. The second prince, third prince, fourth prince, and the seventh prince had died at Yi Zaiwen's hands. And the big prince had been suppressed as well. Therefore, only the 23rd prince had remained amongst the favorites. So, he had eventually obtained the title of the emperor. And people's expectations had again fallen into his hands. He had ascended the throne 2 years ago. However, not everyone was convinced with his credentials. So, the wood dragon had to come out of the heavenly pit in order to help him in stabilizing his regime. However, Yi Shiwen had decided to wander inside the heavenly pit. In fact, that great sage expert of the Northern Dipper had also searched about for the treasures for several months. However, he hadn't found anything worthwhile here. Therefore, he had left much sooner. Many other great sage experts had also left in a similar fashion. They had certainly found many exotic treasures. But these treasures weren't very useful for them. Otherwise, Yi Shiwen and that small Jupiter wouldn't have been considered as the most ferocious people around. This little girl's name was Xiaoya. Yi Shiwen had met her when she was being chased by some ancient demon beasts. He had rescued her in a very convenient fashion. He had then asked her about how she had gotten there. But she didn't know anything about herself. In fact, it seemed as if her memory had been sealed by someone. She only remembered her name Xiaoya. Therefore, Yi Shiwen had no choice but to take her along. Fortunately, Xiaoya was exceptionally cute. She never quarreled and never made any noise. In other words, she was far well behaved than that wolf cub. Therefore, he had happily kept her by his side. His cultivation had strengthened enormously in these 3 years. His cultivation of intermediate stage of Sage Realm had consolidated by now. So, he could make the breakthrough into the late stage of the Sage Realm at will. It could be estimated that he would be able to contend against the experts of the Sage Great Perfection Realm without the support of the Star Colossus once he had made the breakthrough. Yi Shiwen had disguised himself, and he had even used the restraining breath technique to transform the Star Colossus into a human form. However, too many flaws had remained despite his best efforts. Consequently, he would still be exposed to danger if he were to come across a top expert. It was very important for him to be strong enough to deal with these external forces. He didn't get much time to think since the food arrived soon after. He obviously didn't need to eat. However, Xiaoya did. So, he only observed Xiaoya's gentle and refined movements as she ate. Her small mouth would swallow the food very slowly. However, she was eating at a very quick speed for someone her age. Yi Shiwen was watching someone eating so gently yet with such ferocity for the first time. Xiaoya had soon consumed everything that had been set on the table. She then turned her small face towards Yi Shiwen. She seemingly felt a bit embarrassed. And Yi Shiwen was also left to wonder. How could her small belly pack so much? Yi Shiwen didn't stay once Xiaoya had finished eating. He picked up Xiaoya, transformed into a streamer, and disappeared into the city. Everyone heaved a sigh of relief after both individuals had departed. After all, Yi Zaiwen's deterrent force had affected them very significantly under the shade of the enlightening mind ancient tree. Moreover, they had been discussing about him when he had arrived. Subsequently, they were afraid that he would kill them if he were in a bad mood. The people of the meteor sect had also received this news. So, they arrived here not long after Yi Shiwen had left. However, they were unaware that Yi Shiwen had already flown off into the space. Where are we going? Xiaoya looked at him and asked in her soft voice. Xiaoya was standing beside Yi Shiwen above the escaping light high up in the sky. The loud astral winds in the upper atmosphere had nearly overshadowed her voice. However, Yi Shiwen had still heard it since the astral wind couldn't affect his hearing. We're going home. Yi Shiwen gently smiled and replied. He had been wandering for several years now. So, he wanted to return. However, he didn't wish to use the Northern Dipper's transmission portals to return. Instead, he wanted to return on his own. He would have to fight Chao Yuyu in another 10 years. Chao Yuyu had entered the Sage Great Perfection Realm a few years ago. So, it wasn't clear to what extent he would have grown after 10 years. Yi Shiwen was no match for him as per his current cultivation. Moreover, the Star Colossus couldn't help him in this case. In fact, he couldn't even reveal it since it would be too bad for him if the high-level experts found out about it. Moreover, this was his trump card. So, he would take it out only if he was in a life or death situation. He could only strive to promote himself to the peak of Sage Realm in these 10 years. Only then could he contend against Xiao Yuyu. Not much time was left. Home. This word was very strange for Xiaoya. She didn't remember anything when Yi Shiwen had met her. She didn't even know how she had arrived inside the heavenly pit. The first thing she remembered was that she was trying to hide from those ancient demon beasts that were chasing her. Yi Shiwen nodded. He had already made a plan. He would make Xiaoya enter the true martial university after their return because he had found out that she possessed dreadful talent. He had met her 1 year ago. And he had taught her the bright jade cultivation technique 6 months ago. This was the technique that he had used for laying his foundation in the past. Who could have imagined that she would make the breakthrough into the Xiantian realm in just 6 months? It had nearly depressed Yi Shiwen to death. He had gone through so many trials in order to make that breakthrough. He alone knew how many dangerous expeditions he had gone on. However, Xiaoya hadn't needed to do anything. She had automatically made the breakthrough into the Xiantian realm. In fact, Yi Shiwen hadn't even given her any medicinal pills for support. He hadn't given her a medicinal pill because she wasn't like him. He could digest those pills with the help of his mysterious space. Those pills could neither have any bizarre effect on him, nor could they shake his foundation. However, the fact that it had worked on him didn't mean that it would work on others as well. So, he wanted to make her practice for a few years so that he could observe her and polish her foundation. Who could have imagined that she would improve at such a lightning speed? She had entered the Xiantian realm in just 6 months. Such talent was enough to blow him away. In fact, she was talented enough to shatter the pride of those Heaven's Pride experts. Thus, he had sprouted the plan to make Xiaoya enter the true martial university after his return. However, he wouldn't let her join the Hidden Star Peak. Instead, he'd have her enlist in some other heritage. After all, the Hidden Star Peak was in an extremely miserable condition. In fact, the entire heritage was in ruins. It could be said that they would have kept on trying to mend the complete version of the Hidden Star scripture generation after generation if Yi Shiwen hadn't mended it for them. It wasn't the time for the university to recruit the disciples. That only happened once in 100 years. However, it wasn't a difficult thing for him to make a person enter the true martial university. This was due to his status of a core disciple as well as a Heaven's Pride expert. In fact, it would be a piece of cake for him. Moreover, people would always welcome such a genius with open arms. It had been a grand occasion for Yi Shiwen when he was in Yuan School and the true martial university had opened its gates to recruit new disciples. After all, it was a once-in-a-century event. Therefore, he had put his entire effort to get recruited. However, putting someone through the admission process was nothing more than a slight show of strength and status for the current Yi Shiwen. His status and strength had changed. So had his vision. Ants on the ground can never see the eagles hovering in the sky. Let's go, Yi Shiwen stated in a loud voice. Then, he suddenly accelerated the speed of his flying light. He tore his way through the vast sky, and flew out of the meteor world's atmosphere. What the hell is this place? Yi Shiwen was in the void. He was standing above a desolate planet. There was nothing in sight. The starry space was spread as far as he could see. He had arrived in this section of space after flying for 3 months since he had left the meteor world. However, he had been wandering here for 1 month now, and he still couldn't get out of this starry space. Hallucinatory star field. Yi Shiwen checked in his star atlas and exclaimed. He had gotten hold of the Northern Dipper's top-secret star atlas. The star atlas stated that this star region was known as the hallucinatory star field because it was very difficult to travel through this section of the space. The space was overlapping, and there were many natural transmission portals lying around. Therefore, one might end up passing through one of these natural transmission portals if one weren't careful. Consequently, one would be sent back to the beginning of the region. This place wasn't as dangerous as some other parts of the space. However, many people had gotten trapped here and had eventually died. Yi Shiwen shouldn't have needed these many days to cross this place since he had Sage Realm cultivation. Moreover, he also had deployed his demon wings. However, he had still been wandering in this region for 1 month now. Xiaoya was cutely standing beside him. She didn't say anything. She merely raised her small face and looked at Yi Shiwen. She seldom spoke. In fact, she wouldn't have uttered a single word in this 1 month if Yi Shiwen hadn't asked her to. Let's go and have a look. Yi Shiwen had detected some fluctuations. They had seemingly resulted from a fight that was happening far away. The fluctuations were very fine since they had transmitted from far away. However, he had still detected them. And he had become excited because the people who were fighting could turn out to be some acquaintances. And they could possibly guide him out of this place if that were the case. Yi Shiwen had only flown forward for a moment when he saw that dozens of people were closely sticking together inside a boundless star field. And they were surrounded by several hundred star beasts. Damn it! How have we landed into a group of star beasts? It's not like our clan has arrived at this hallucinatory star field for the first time. In fact, we already knew that these star beasts inhabit this region. So, how could we land into their group by mistake? The people of Li clan must have been responsible for this. An expert who appeared to be in his 30s bitterly spoke up as he brandished a blade towards those star beasts. His cultivation had already entered the initial stage of the Sage Realm. His blade carried extraordinary might. However, these star beasts were even more ferocious. In fact, more than 1/3 of them were at the Sage Realm. Therefore, he had slowly been forced to retreat even though he was strong. Concentrate on them and don't complain. What's the use of saying these things at this time? First we need to get out of here. Only then can we settle the debt with those bastards. A middle-aged man spoke up at this time. He stood beside that seemingly 30-year-old expert. Yi Shiwen was surprised to see his robust tall figure. He was waving his spear as if it were a dragon. Those star beasts screamed and transformed into blood fog wherever that spear went. His cultivation made it seem as if he had entered Sage Small Perfection realm long ago. So, a single blow from his spear was enough to kill one of those star beasts of initial stage of Sage realm. Moreover, it could conveniently kill a large number of those semi-sage level star beasts as well. This battle had transformed into a bloodbath. Both sides had suffered a disastrous number of casualties. Therefore, the star beasts that had surrounded them suddenly withdrew. They no longer encircled them. Those experts relaxed to some extent after those star beasts had retreated. They promptly sat down cross-legged in the space and began to meditate in order to restore the energy inside their bodies. The richer ones among them used medicinal pills to restore their energy. Medicinal pills were precious. However, it was more important to preserve life at such a dangerous place. Who is there? That spear-wielding middle-aged man shouted at this time. His knife-like sharp vision swept inside the void. Don't worry. We mean no harm. 2 figures slowly appeared in the space. Chapter 525. Don't worry. We mean no harm. 2 figures slowly appeared in the space. A tall figure dressed up in green appeared in front of everyone. There was another short figure with him. This silhouette wore blue clothes. Everyone let out a sigh of relief when they noticed that this man's cultivation was only at the intermediate stage of the Sage Realm. So, they didn't need to worry even if this man harbored malice. After all, what could an insignificant expert of the intermediate stage of the Sage Realm do? A dozen or so individuals in this group were at the intermediate stage of the Sage Realm. Some of them were also at the late stage of the Sage Realm. Moreover, some were even at the peak stage of the Sage Realm. That middle-aged man was at the Sage Small Complete Realm. In fact, an expert of the intermediate stage of the Sage Realm posed no threat to him even though he had sustained serious injuries. "Who are you?" the middle-aged man asked. He felt somewhat alienated from these 2 individuals. However, he wasn't very vigilant. What could an insignificant expert of the intermediate stage of the Sage Realm do? He could suppress him with the flick of his hand. "We are travelers. My younger sister and I have accidentally arrived in the hallucinatory star field. Now, we can't find a way out of this place. We don't know if we can get out of here on our own. Can you take us along with you so that we can leave this place? It will be a big favor on us. Yi Shiwen cupped his hands in gratitude and said, taking you along with us isn't an issue. However, you've also seen that we've perhaps been trapped by someone. We're already in the borderline zone of the hallucinatory star field. However, we may come across an unavoidable deadly fight at any time. And it won't be good if you were to come to harm because of us. So, you must give it a proper thought first. The middle-aged man smiled and explained the situation in a straightforward manner. Villa Lord, you mustn't do this. Villa Lord, you mustn't do this. God knows if the Li clan may have sent these people. We may possibly get exposed if we take them along with us. And we may have to face an endless number of star beasts if that's the case. Consequently, it would become very difficult for us to find the green-scaled fruit for sister-in-law. The man who had used the blade promptly stepped forward and spoke up. The voice of the middle-aged man hadn't even faded when many of the other experts started attempting to dissuade him in quick succession. It was evident that they were extremely careful. They were afraid that Yi Shiwen could be an enemy spy or whatnot. I have already made up my mind, the middle-aged man firmly said. We have already lost many young brothers in our quest for the green-scaled fruit. How can I, Yen Hongyi, lose any more of our young brothers because of my family's affair? Villa Lord, we are doing this willingly. Even the brothers who have died would have no complaints. Sister-in-law treats us so well. She doesn't look down on us because of our lowly background. We shall not give up, no matter what. That blade wielder firmly replied. Shut up. Do you wish to lose all of our brothers here? Yen Hongyi, the middle-aged man, chided him. I've decided to plunder the great building. I've also heard that someone had once found the green-scaled fruit inside the great building. It's still much better than trying to find a needle in a haystack inside this hallucinatory star field. Yi Shiwen started to admire Yen Hongyi as he heard his words. He had seen so many cold-blooded leaders who had never hesitated in putting the lives of their subordinates in danger for their own aim. In fact, leaders were callous and cold-hearted. Therefore, it was rare to come across an affectionate leader like Yen Hongyi. Yen Hongyi was extremely majestic. That blade wielder was very reluctant to give up. However, he couldn't disobey Yen Hongyi's words after Yen Hongyi had scolded him. Yen Hongyi saw that everyone was reluctant. However, they didn't dare to go against his words either. He turned around towards Yi Shiwen and said, I'm sorry. This family drama must have amused you. There's nothing to pardon. The righteousness of the Villa Lord has only made me admire you even more. Yi Shiwen cupped his hands in obeisance and stated. Yen Hongyi sighed and said, I am Yen Hongyi, the Villa Lord of the Piyuan Villa that lies in the jurisdiction of Shangyang City. And these are my younger brothers. I am Yi Shiwen. It's nice to meet you, Villa Lord Yen. And this is my little sister Xiaoya. Yi Shiwen gave the introduction. We would be troubling you for a little while, Villa Lord Yen. No problem at all. Young brother Yi, you are most welcome. It's not a big thing. We will go forward once we've tidied up here. Yen Hongyi smiled and said in a straightforward manner. He then turned around and ordered everyone to collect the corpses of those star beasts. These were top-notch materials. Moreover, many of the wounded individuals required some care. Everyone's working speed was very quick. They were acting in harmony and were showing mutual understanding and coordination. It was obvious that they weren't doing this for the first time. So, everyone knew that they must pack up as soon as possible. Else, the smell of blood might attract other greedy star beasts. These people were used to drifting aimlessly in the space. It was hard to tell how superior their skills were in these matters in front of an amateur like Yi Shiwen. Our Villa Lord is kind that he has offered you shelter. You had better not be a spy of the Li clan. Otherwise, you are done for. The blade wielder flew over to Yi Shiwen and warned him in a cold manner. His fierce expression scared Xiaoya as she stood beside Yi Shiwen. So, she slightly retreated from her current position. She was visibly somewhat scared. Yi Shiwen frowned. He didn't like this. However, he didn't attack. He must get out of this hallucinatory star field with the help of these people. Anyway, he would part ways with them after he had gotten out of the star field. So, there would be no dispute afterwards. Moreover, Yi Shiwen had noticed that this blade-wielding man had a bad attitude. However, he had also realized that this man was thinking about the well-being of his Pyun villa. Yi Shiwen certainly didn't like his attitude, but he couldn't say that he hated it either. The blade wielder went to help other people in clearing the stuff after he had warned Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen looked at Xiaoya with a calm and gentle expression in his eyes. It seems like someone is targeting this team. Yi Shiwen had caught this information from the conversation between these people. However, it didn't bother him. He would merely take out the corpse of the Star Colossus, and he would death-slap anyone who'd try to cause him trouble. In fact, this would hold true as long as he didn't come across a great sage expert. Moreover, he was confident that he would manage to escape even if a great sage expert were to attack. The blood slave had become increasingly proficient at controlling the Star Colossus. So, Yi Shiwen had stopped making it come out of the Star Colossus body. Yi Shiwen simply made the blood slave reside in the body of the Star Colossus, and had been slowly transforming into its soul. This had indeed been a very big help for him. Yi Shiwen had averted disaster many times in these last 3 years' expeditions because the blood slave was controlling the Star Colossus. The blood slave would be able to unleash the full potential of this Star Colossus once it would completely transform into the soul of this Star Colossus. Then, even the great sage experts wouldn't be a problem anymore. Of course, this would happen after many years. The people of the Pyuan villa cleared up the corpses rather quickly. Yen Hongyi took out a ship-shaped divine tool after everyone had cleared up the area. It was a pseudo-sage tool that was used for sailing in space. However, it was good enough for moving faster. Everyone went aboard the ship. The ship then transformed into a streamer of light and shuttled in the universe. Yi Shiwen was standing on the deck of this large ship. He realized that the ship was moving at such a high speed that he couldn't even feel the outside. Moreover, it was sailing so smoothly that it seemed as if it was treading on level ground. He had never ridden on a speed-type divine tool because he was a lone operator. Moreover, he also had a magical power like the devil wings. Also, he had never seen a divine tool that could catch up with his sage realm speed. However, he felt that he required a similar speed-type divine tool that could fly. This was because he had a little girl along with him now. Young brother Yi, don't mind that Hu Engguo's words. That guy is always like that, but he doesn't have bad intentions. Yen Hongyi walked up to Yi Zaiwen's side and said, "It appeared that there was no need to worry about driving this ship. One only needed to input the route in such flying divine tools. These tools could then fly on autopilot mode." Yi Shiwen smiled. He knew that Yen Hongyi was referring to the person who had come to warn him a while ago. However, he didn't care about it either. After all, his temper would go out of hand in his lifetime if something like this would start to bother him. "It's all right." Yi Shiwen laughed. "It doesn't matter. Where does young brother Yi come from, and where is he headed?" Yen Hongyi asked. "I have come from the meteor world, and I haven't decided where I wish to go. So, I can go anywhere." Haha. Yi Shiwen laughed and replied. He hadn't decided where he wanted to go. He could go to any place that would come along the way as long as he was traveling in the direction of the true martial world. It would obviously depend upon the situation at the time. However, he hadn't thought about any particular place that he wanted to go to. Young brother Yi might as well visit our Pyun villa since he hasn't decided where he wishes to go. Yen Hongyi smiled and said. He looked at Xiaoya. He was indeed straightforward and generous. However, he was no fool. He had showed special fondness towards Yi Shiwen, and had hitched him a ride. However, it wasn't that he had made this decision in a casual manner. After all, he was the leader of a force. And the survival of this force depended on his actions. So, he could take this force to hell if he wasn't careful. He had favored Yi Shiwen because of Xiaoya. He had never seen someone with such a pure bearing. She was as pure as a baby. She was without the slightest bit of contamination. Someone with such a pure mind could instinctively judge who was good and who was bad. After all, no amount of disguise could conceal one's malice from an infant. And Xiaoya was so close to Yi Shiwen. This showed that Yi Shiwen wasn't a bad person. This was the reason why he had allowed Yi Shiwen to come aboard the ship. And he believed that his judgment couldn't be wrong. After all, he hadn't been the leader of this force for so many years for nothing. He must have some ability to make good judgments. Yi Shiwen obviously didn't know what was inside Yan Hongyi's mind. However, he became very excited because of this invitation. The so-called a man is alive when he walks on the most dangerous roads, eats the best delicacies, has the most beautiful woman, fights the most powerful enemies, makes friends with the heroes who deserve his friendship, and does what he loves to do. And Yi Shiwen believed that a man like Yan Hongyi was undoubtedly worthy of his friendship. Well, how can I refuse if the elder brother has invited me? Yi Shiwen smiled back. Anyway, he hadn't decided where he wanted to go. So, he could easily go with the flow for now. Good, you're very frank and straightforward. Yan Hongyi admired Yi Shiwen when he saw that Yi Shiwen was neither timid nor fake. Chapter 526 Assists in the Fight. Bang! The ship was flying with a fast speed when it suddenly began to shake violently. It seemed as if it had met with a huge impact. Villalord, it's not good. Several hundred star beasts have appeared in front. A man suddenly came tumbling out from the crowd. Everyone looked on, and found that several hundred star beasts had surrounded the ship. Moreover, each of them was as big as a hill. They looked like the magnified versions of fierce wolves. Their entire bodies were covered with silver fur. And that silver fur was glowing in this dark universe. There were innumerable. And these hundreds of beasts had tightly contained them in the space. Damn it! They found us! Yan Hongyi's complexion turned unsightly as he said these words. A dreadful aura soared into the sky from the middle of these star beasts group. Then, a fierce mountain-sized wolf slowly appeared in front of everyone. Fierce Star Wolf King. Everyone's complexion turned deathly pale when they saw this monster. They even forgot about those other hill-sized fierce star wolves. There was usually a certain relation between height and strength. However, it didn't necessarily mean that one was going to be insanely powerful because one had a big stature. However, this fierce Star Wolf King had truly frightened them. It had already surpassed the peak of the Sage Realm and was currently at the Sage Small Perfection Realm. And this had scared them out of their wits. Yan Hongyi was the strongest among the people of the Piyuan Villa. He was at the Sage Small Perfection Realm. However, he would have to put everything at stake while fighting this Wolf King. Obviously, it wouldn't be that easy since this Wolf King's ominous energy had gone off the charts. The outcome of a fight between a fierce beast and human expert of the same realm would be difficult to predict. Some experts would win, while others would lose rather tragically. This varied from person to person. There were some geniuses who possessed the power to crush opponents belonging to the same realm. It wouldn't have been a very difficult thing to deal with this fierce Star Wolf King for such a genius. After all, they possessed superb divine tools, outstanding cultivation, and an ancient heritage. So, their attacks were far more powerful than those of their peers. However, it wasn't that easy for ordinary people. They neither possessed powerful divine tools, nor did they have formidable martial arts roots. Moreover, they didn't even have a solid foundation. Consequently, even a group of 3 such individuals would be unable to defeat a fierce beast of the same realm. Finally arrived? Yi Shiwen muttered. He shot a glance towards that powerful-looking fierce Star Wolf King. Then he looked at Xiaoya with a smile of reassurance. After all, she didn't need to worry as long as he was there with her. However, he didn't know that Xiaoya wasn't worried. Her complexion had remained unchanged. She had faced all kinds of situations ever since she had tagged with Yi Shiwen. It seemed as if she felt that there was no need to worry as long as Yi Shiwen was by her side. Brothers, we are in this predicament because of me. So, it is my duty to go and engage that fierce Star Wolf King. Meanwhile, you guys must look for an opportunity to escape. Yan Hongyi took out a spear, grinned, and said these words. The look in his eyes made it seem that he didn't find himself to be a match for these star beasts. Villalord, let's go together. We aren't afraid of death. These star beasts have surrounded us. How can we escape? So, let's go together. We mustn't let these lowly beasts ridicule us, even if we die. These star beasts had long been wise and clever. This was because they possessed spiritual intelligence. Their battle formation resembled that of a battalion of soldiers. They had already surrounded them from all directions. Moreover, their encirclement seemed to be impenetrable. Come with me. I will go and engage that fierce Starwolf King. Come to give me backup if you guys manage to kill those other fierce wolves in time. We still have a chance of survival. Yen Hongyi didn't resist any further. After all, he knew that his previous plan was hopeless. Moreover, there was only a slim chance of survival, and that too only if they went all out to hold their own against these beasts. Young brother Yi, I'm sorry that I've dragged you into this. I shouldn't have done that. You must take off with little sister as soon as you get the opportunity. Yen Hongyi said, Relax. I have a plan. Yi Shiwen replied. However, he felt that many of the people of Piyuan Villa that surrounded him were looking at him with bad intentions. He deliberated a bit and understood that these people were suspecting him of being a spy of the Li clan, just as Huanghua had earlier suspected him. They felt that it couldn't be a coincidence that they had come across these many fierce beasts after a mysterious person had come aboard their ship. It was also probable that he was the one who had attracted these beasts. Yi Shiwen merely smiled. After all, everything would become clear from the outcome of his actions at this juncture. Howl! Everyone was still discussing here, but that fierce Starwolf King couldn't wait anymore. So it howled loudly, and its howl shook the entire world. The void collapsed, and a huge black crack spread out wherever the sound waves from its howl went. Then the huge crack spread out towards the ship. Humph! Yen Hongyi coldly snorted. He advanced and arrived at the front of the ship. He pointed his spear towards the vast emptiness, and a boundless ripple proliferated and scattered in the vast space. Then that ripple suddenly collided with that huge crack. Bang! A vast chunk of the void collapsed under the suppression force. The fight between two senior experts of the Sage Small Perfection realm had barely begun. However, it had already shaken the entire world. Everyone's expressions had turned serious. The first clash was enough to determine that this Starwolf King was much more tyrannical than they had previously imagined. The Starwolf King's loud howl stirred up the flock of fierce wolves, and their eyes turned red. Their claws dug into the space and split open deep black cracks in the void. Howl! The fierce Starwolf King let out a loud howl like a sonic boom. Those fierce wolves also looked upward and howled one after another. They had launched a long-range raid towards the ship by doing so. The long-range raid of each of those small hill-sized beasts was overwhelming. The void shook as they approached with a scary momentum. It seemed as if violent waves were causing turbulence in an ocean. Die! The people of the Piyuan Villa also roared as they rushed out to face those fierce starwolves. Bang! The seemingly endless horde of the fierce starwolves suddenly collided with the matrix formation that was protecting the ship. 1/3 of the matrix formation was destroyed in a flash. This was inevitable since these fierce starwolves were too many in number. Even the ship's protective layer couldn't endure such a massive impact. However, the semi-sage level fierce wolves were instantly turned into ashes by the barrier. Yi Ziwen's expression had also turned stern. The real fight was about to begin. The ominous aura of the enemy penetrated through the void and blew against his face. This was a true battle. Be a good girl and stay on the ship until I return. All right. Yi Shiwen looked at Xiaoya and spoke after everyone had left the ship. Xiaoya was only at the Xiantian Small Perfection realm at present. Her cultivation speed was extremely quick. However, she couldn't travel in the space by herself. Moreover, she could die here because there was no air in this place. This was her vulnerability, and nothing could be done about it. Earlier, Yi Shiwen was there to protect her. However, he would have to engage in the battle now. He couldn't dare to say that he could protect her out there, at least not with confidence. Therefore, it was better to make her stay on the ship. Okay. Xiaoya softly replied. She was a very clever kid. Yen Hongyi had already started to clash with that fierce Starwolf King. His spear was waving like a dragon. It devoured a vast chunk of space as it rushed towards that fierce Starwolf King. Yen Hongyi didn't hold back. His entire real elemental energy suddenly burst out of his body with an incredible spear beam. Howl! The fierce Starwolf King opened its large mouth, as if it were a sacrificial bowl. A dreadful spirit energy fluctuated and burst out of its mouth. The terrifying cannon beam traveled through the void and collided with Yen Hongyi's spear beam. Bang! Two great powerhouses had begun to clash, and this resulted in crackling sounds being produced. The scene looked exceptionally stunning. The clash of their dreadful powers resulted in energy waves from the point of the collision. Those energy waves then swept all across, and they shattered the space wherever they went. The fierce Starwolf King issued an angry howl, and its silver fur began to glow golden. Then it dug its claws into the space, bolted forward explosively, and transformed into a golden streamer. It arrived in front of Yen Hongyi in an instant. Yen Hongyi hadn't thought that this fierce Starwolf King would have such incredible speed. He hadn't even gotten any time to react, but it had already arrived in front of him. However, he couldn't retreat. That's because his whole team would collapse if he were to fall back. He could only clench his teeth and prepare for battle. He brandished his spear, and suddenly trampled the void under his feet. Then he darted forward like a rolling mountain to crush that approaching golden light. Boom! The boundless collision issued dreadful energy waves. The void shook, and cracks that resembled a spider's web spread out. A tremendous energy wave swirled about violently, and a figure was sent flying by that shock wave. It was Yen Hongyi. Yen Hongyi felt a strange taste in his mouth. He was about to spout a mouthful of blood. However, he knew that he couldn't spout blood at this. After all, his power would suffer a heavy loss if he did that. Therefore, he forcibly swallowed the blood essence. Consequently, his face turned an unusually dark shade of red. Moreover, he was forced to retreat over a dozen meters before he was able to break his momentum. These human experts were undoubtedly weaker when compared to these fierce beasts. Therefore, fighting with these fierce beasts was akin to courting death for a majority of these human experts. However, that wasn't true for a freak like Yi Shiwen. The fierce star wolves weren't considered among the top-notch star beasts. Nonetheless, their ferocity and instincts far surpassed that of humans. However, the human experts had one advantage over these fierce beasts. They possessed intelligence. They could use tools, divine tools, talismans, and whatnot. Only these things made the human experts eligible to contend against these fierce beasts. Yen Hongyi was an old expert of the society, so he obviously knew this fact very well. However, he didn't have any other method at this time. Moreover, he couldn't retreat. He could only drag time since he had to hold up until the people of the Puyun Villa had killed those other fierce beasts. They could then help him escape, or they could provide him with backup. He would obviously have more room to choose then. Howl! The eyes of the Silver Wolf King had turned red. Moreover, there was an ominous glint in them. The Wolf King issued a thunderous howl once again. Its claws suddenly grabbed the void and issued a metal clanging sound. It opened its mouth like a sacrificial bowl once again. Endless spirit energies suddenly gathered, and another spirit energy cannon beam was ejected, but not towards Yen Hongyi. Instead, it was directed towards the ship. This Silver Wolf King was sentient and had already acquired spiritual intelligence. So, it had obviously made out that these human experts wouldn't be able to escape without their ship. In fact, they would be sitting ducks. Yi Zaiwen's exceptional flying magical power was extremely rare. The majority of human experts didn't have a divine tool they could use for flying away. Consequently, their flying speeds were no match for those of these demon beasts. It's not good. Damn it. Yen Hongyi stopped minding the Silver Wolf King for the time being. However, it was already too late for him to stop this attack that was going towards the ship. However, a frightening sword rainbow dropped from above at this time. Chapter 527. Astonishes everyone. Bang! The sword energy fell down from above and exploded with incredible energy fluctuations. The entire space disintegrated under the crushing suppression of the sword energy. Yen Hongyi was left in a state of shock by this sudden assistance. However, he soon found out that this unexpected helper was none other than Yi Shiwen. It was that young man whom he had never taken seriously. You must quickly run away. This is a demon beast of the sage small perfection realm. You're no match for it. Yen Hongyi promptly shouted. Yi Shiwen merely grinned in reply. Yen Hongyi was still asking him to run away. This was a rare occurrence. In fact, any other person would have sacrificed the helper's life to save their own. On the ship, Xiaoya looked serene as she witnessed Yi Zaiwen's aura. It had become even more tyrannical with the passage of time. An overbearing energy was raging inside Yi Zaiwen's slim figure. Huanghua was staring blankly at Yi Shiwen. In fact, he looked embarrassed. After all, he hadn't expected Yi Shiwen to act like this. Therefore, he was very surprised that the person who had saved their ship had turned out to be Yi Shiwen, the same man whom he had doubted earlier. Consequently, he was forced to reconsider his opinion of Yi Shiwen. The expression in Yi Zaiwen's eyes had condensed, and his pupils looked profound. It seemed as if the birth and destruction of the universe was taking place within his eyes. Howl! The fierce Starwolf King howled once again. An ominous and severe energy began to surge inside its body. Its eyes were red. It suddenly trod with its claws. And it seemed as if the void beneath its claws had been ripped apart. Then, it quickly drilled through the void and pounced towards Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen shot his fist in retaliation. It transformed into a huge star and swept down. Bang! Yi Zaiwen's fist suddenly pounded the body of the fierce Starwolf King. A terrifying explosion resounded as a result. In fact, it seemed as if this sound had originated from the collision between two planets. And boundless energy waves swept across. How is this possible? He blocked that fierce Starwolf King by using his fist. How the hell is this possible? He is using his body to contend against this massive beast? Am I dreaming or something? Everyone was stunned when they saw this scene unfold before their eyes. After all, they believed that an average human expert couldn't contend against a demon beast. A human expert needed to have those divine tools, talismans, and whatnot if they wanted to contend against a demon beast. Moreover, it would be difficult to confront a demon beast king even if one were to use divine tools. In fact, a human expert could contend against a demon beast king of the same realm only if one were to be at the pinnacle among human experts of that realm. However, he was fighting that fierce Starwolf King barehanded. And it seemed as if he hadn't even gone all out yet. But the thing that had surprised them the most was that Yi Shiwen wasn't the one who had been sent flying away because of that explosion. Instead, it had been that fierce Starwolf King. Bang! Yi Zaiwen's fist transformed into a huge star and pounded the tip of that fierce Starwolf King's nose. That fierce Starwolf King went flying upside down, and its blood started to splash out. Everyone was left dumbstruck as they witnessed this scene. Yi Shiwen had struck the tip of that fierce Starwolf King's nose. It was the weakest part of a star beast's body. However, even the weakest part of star beast's body was as hard as iron. What kind of a monster was Yi Shiwen to be able to pull this off? Everyone was staring blankly at Yi Shiwen. And Yen Hongyi was no exception. He had been greatly shocked by this scene and remained speechless for a long time. Moreover, he had also become a bit depressed. After all, he had tried his best against this demon beast. But he had failed to fend it off even then. However, Yi Shiwen had done that easily, and that too whilst being unarmed. Villa Lord Yen, thanks for letting us get aboard your ship. I have nothing to repay you with. So, I will deal with this beast for you as a means to show my gratitude. Yi Shiwen looked at Yen Hongyi and spoke up. Perhaps, it wasn't a big deal for Yen Hongyi to take Yi Shiwen along with him. However, it was a very big deal for Yi Shiwen. He was confident that he wouldn't have stayed trapped in this place forever. However, he might have had to waste a year's time, or even more in order to escape this place if he hadn't met Yen Hongyi and his crew. And he obviously didn't wish to waste so much time. Similarly, it was no big deal for Yi Shiwen to deal with this monster. However, it was a life-saving grace for Yen Hongyi. Yi Shiwen didn't pay heed to Yen Hongyi after he had finished speaking. Instead, he shifted his attention towards that fierce Starwolf King. It had become even more violent after sustaining injuries at the hands of Yi Shiwen. The hair on its body had stood up and transformed into spikes. In fact, it looked like a hedgehog when inverted. However, nobody dared to underestimate it. After all, its hair could inflict a fatal wound. Arrogant brat, the fierce Starwolf King roared. It couldn't conceal the violent look in its eyes as it suddenly rushed out. Its massive body rushed over with the crushing power and pressure of a giant mountain that was rolling over. Thousand Stars Tyrant Palm. Yi Shiwen shouted. His vision was locked on that fierce Starwolf King. A big hand stretched out, and 1,000 palm shadows suddenly appeared in the sky. They then transformed into 1,000 meteors in the universe and rushed towards the fierce Starwolf King. Bang! 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 Those meteors fell from above in quick succession and pounded the body of that fierce Starwolf King. A loud metal clanging sound echoed in the vicinity as a result. The skin of this fierce Starwolf King was supposed to be invulnerable. Even a divine tool couldn't injure it. Even Yen Hongyi hadn't been able to contend against it with a sage tool in his hand. However, Yi Shiwen was different. His tyrant body had reached the 7th layer. Its might had reached a dreadful height. Every palm attack and every fist attack of his was like a giant mountain that could cut off a 1,000-miles-long river. It was incomparably dreadful. The meteors in this 1,000 Stars Tyrant Palm were the embodiments of his heavy fist blows. Therefore, every meteor had gorged out a huge chunk of flesh from the body of that fierce Starwolf King. The body of that fierce Starwolf was supposed to be incredibly powerful, but it had soon turned into a complete mess. It had gotten badly mutilated and had been drenched in blood. The fierce Starwolf King couldn't advance because of the continuous bombardment of Yi Shiwen's 1,000 Stars Tyrant Palm. Therefore, it couldn't come close to Yi Shiwen. In fact, it had been forced to retreat because of the barrage of attacks on the contrary. The protective layer of demon elemental energy couldn't protect it anymore. In fact, the protective layer was receding unceasingly. The fierce Starwolf King had been forced into a difficult situation by Yi Shiwen's attacks. However, it wasn't scared. On the contrary, it became even fiercer. And its ominous power swept in all directions. It suddenly broke the space and appeared in front of Yi Shiwen. Its tail swept out towards him. Its tail was the hardest part of its body. An ordinary expert would be cut into 2 halves if its tail struck them. Yi Shiwen stretched out his hands and grabbed that tail. Bang! His arms trembled. The fierce Starwolf King had used its entire strength. An average person's entire arm would have torn off if they were in Yi Shiwen's place. However, even the web between Yi Shiwen's fingers hadn't been ruptured. His arms had merely trembled a bit at first. However, he managed to grab that tail properly after that. Then he suddenly threw the beast away. Bang! Yi Shiwen threw away the fierce Starwolf King. It went out flying and crashed into a meteor. The meteor shattered and gave rise to a small mushroom cloud of dust. He's fighting with that Star Beast King with his bare hands. Everyone was left thunderstruck as they witnessed this scene. They had thought that Yi Shiwen was overestimating himself. After all, he had dared to put his body at risk by fighting with that Star Beast. Wasn't that akin to courting death? However, they weren't thinking so anymore. Moreover, they had realized that Yi Shiwen was a monster in comparison to that fierce Starwolf King. In fact, they had never seen someone fighting barehanded against a star beast. Stunningly, Yi Shiwen had dominated that star beast since the beginning of the fight. In fact, it seemed as if he was toying with it. They had even forgotten that they too had a star beast opponent to fight. However, even those other star beasts were dumbfounded at this time. After all, their leader was like a god to them. But their leader had unexpectedly been forced into a disadvantageous position by a human in a clash of physical strength. This thing was simply beyond their wildest imaginations. The fierce star wolves didn't have the strongest body among the star beasts. However, their not-so-powerful physical constitution was still very powerful when compared to that of human experts. It was their key strength. However, even this key strength had failed to manifest itself in front of Yi Shiwen. Both sides reacted quickly and engaged in the deadly battle once again. The body of the fierce Star Wolf King had been badly mutilated by Yi Ziwen's attacks this time. The Star Wolf King even felt a little dizzy. Moreover, its fierce eyes were no longer blood-red. They had instead regained their normal shade. It was initially going berserk due to being pushed by some secret method. However, it had been bombarded several times, and had been sent flying here and there. So, the effects of that secret method had finally worn off. And it had come back to its senses as a result. Moreover, it had finally realized that this slim man before its eyes was way too ferocious. And it didn't have the power to defeat this man. "It's over!" Yi Shiwen softly exclaimed. He took the initiative to attack this time, and he suddenly trod on the golden waves. His figure swept forward in a flash. Nobody could see him since their eyes couldn't keep up with his speed. This felt like the legendary magical power as mentioned in the fables. It was said that one could compress the earth with a thumb with the help of this power. Yi Shiwen arrived in front of that fierce Star Wolf King in the blink of an eye amidst the flashes of golden light. The inverting ocean seal condensed instantaneously. It gathered endless spirit energies from all around, and then condensed above Yi Ziwen's head. He raised his hands, and it seemed as if he had lifted a boundless ocean. He looked like that legendary figure mentioned in the fables that had lifted the heavens for countless years. "Ha!" Yi Shiwen shouted loudly, and the boundless ocean poured down at once. Its dreadful weight suppressed and broke down the void. It transformed into a huge seal midway and swept down with a crushing force. It might have taken a lot of time to describe what was happening. However, everything had happened in a split second. The speed of Yi Ziwen's seal attack was incredibly quick. He had manifested and unleashed the inverting ocean seal in an instant. And it had pounded that fierce Star Wolf King immediately after. Moreover, the fierce Star Wolf King was still feeling confused and disoriented when the inverting ocean seal came down upon him. Bang! A loud explosion sounded. The fierce Star Wolf King was minced by the inverting ocean seal. The heavenly source mirror slowly emitted scarlet light within Yi Ziwen's body. And the body and essence of the fierce Star Wolf King was absorbed by the heavenly source mirror along with its most important part, the demon core. The heavenly source mirror had become much more powerful than it was 3 years ago. After all, it had recovered a lot during Yi Ziwen's 3 years of expeditions. It won't be too long before the heavenly source mirror recovers. Yi Shiwen said in his heart. "We've luckily survived this time, thanks to young brother Yi. It's a huge favor. I don't have words to thank you." "Cuckoo." Yen Hongyi coughed as he arrived beside Yi Shiwen. He then patted his shoulder and said, Chapter 528. Talking nonsense can get a person killed. "It's nothing. It's not a big deal." Yi Shiwen smiled. It truly wasn't a big thing for him. Fighting demon beasts was much simpler than fighting complex and cunning humans. One merely needed strength to crush the beasts. In fact, one would have the power to crush these beasts if one had great strength, real elemental energy, and other such things. And Yi Shiwen had gained an upper hand in all these aspects. The legends stated that the main objective of his tyrant body secret was to go on expeditions against devils and gods. Therefore, dealing with these demon beasts must be very easy for him. It wasn't difficult to deal with demon beasts after having an upper hand in all these aspects. In fact, dealing with human experts was much more difficult than dealing with these beasts. After all, the human experts had much more than formidable strength alone. They also had all kinds of divine tools, talismans, and whatnot in abundance. Therefore, Yi Shiwen felt that it was much more difficult to deal with human experts. "Cuckoo." Yen Hongyi suddenly coughed once again. Blood also came out from his mouth along with the coughing. His complexion had turned pale. "Are you all right?" Yi Shiwen promptly asked. "I'm fine. It's nothing. It's just old injuries. They've resurfaced due to my fight with that beast. Plus, I've also sustained some new injuries in that fight. I'm all right. Hey, I'm getting old. These injuries wouldn't have had any effect on me if I had been young." Yen Hongyi waved his hand. He smiled reluctantly and used his martial power to suppress the injuries. Yi Shiwen didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Getting old? What kind of a joke was it? An expert would become more and more powerful as their cultivation deepened with age. Consequently, an older expert would possess more powerful vitality and vigor than the younger ones, unless they were on the verge of death. Those remaining star beasts couldn't escape, and were killed very quickly with Yi Ziwen's assistance. Moreover, the team hadn't suffered huge losses since Yi Shiwen had killed that fierce Starwolf King in time. Everyone's opinion of Yi Shiwen had also changed. They hadn't liked him initially. They had arrived here in the hallucinatory star field with the determination to lay down their lives. These chosen people of the villa were second to none. After all, the villa had so many experts. And Yi Shiwen was merely at the intermediate stage of the Sage Realm. So what could he have possibly achieved? However, they were amazed after they witnessed Yi Ziwen's strength. They were trying to avoid making eye contact with Yi Shiwen at the moment. After all, they had said that he might be a spy of the Li clan. So, they couldn't say anything to redeem themselves at this time. After all, they could only say that they had been rather unfair towards him so far. However, they were also feeling a bit relieved. They would be at ease even if the Li clan played some trick now. After all, they had a formidable expert like Yi Shiwen to keep watch. Their safety factor had enormously increased since they had two Sage Small Perfection level experts to keep watch now. Everyone's behavior towards Yi Shiwen had changed enormously after this matter. Fortunately, they didn't come across any other mishap until they came out of the hallucinatory star field. They then arrived at another star region that was adjacent to the hallucinatory star field, River Shore Star Field. The Piyuan Villa was situated in the Shangyang city. It was less than 10,000 miles away from the borderline of the hallucinatory star field. Perhaps, an ordinary person wouldn't be able to cover this distance in their entire lifetime. However, it wasn't very far for these experts. Yi Shiwen felt that the distorted appearance of the void had switched back to normal once they had come out of the hallucinatory star field. Finally, we've come out of that damned hallucinatory star field. Yi Shiwen let out a sigh of relief. Xiaoya was standing beside him. He touched her small head. However, she only quietly looked at him and didn't say anything in response. A huge city was floating in the space at a distance. It was emitting colorful rays of light that had illuminated this section of the universe. Yen Hongyi told Yi Shiwen that this was the Shangyang city. The Shangyang city was undoubtedly much bigger than the Wind Dragon city. In fact, it was at least 10 times bigger than the Wind Dragon city. This city that was floating in space was established after many experts from various planets had ventured into this section of the universe. They had only established this city for their temporary stay. However, it had gradually developed into an enormous city. In fact, there weren't many cities in the true martial world that could be compared with such a big city. This endlessly spanning city looked pleasing to the eyes. One couldn't see its edge. The rays of light emanating from the barrier formations on the city's walls would flicker from time to time. Every section of the city's wall was covered with layers of matrix formation. This had been done in order to protect the city from the attacks of the star beasts. The faces of the Piyuan Villa's people had a look of exhaustion when they saw that their home wasn't very far now. After all, they had been on the expedition in the hallucinatory star field for a very long time. Even the sage experts would get worn out in that strange starry region. So, nobody had dared to relax even a bit at that place. However, they now got some sense of relaxation when they saw that their home was right in front of them. Many experts were going through the required procedure for entering the city at the gates. The majority of them were legendary experts. The truth experts were very rare. However, the ratio of truth experts varied from world to world. This place was unlike various other worlds. So, it was difficult for the truth experts to survive in a starry region. In fact, it was even more difficult for them to survive in this starry region since it was very far from other inhabited worlds. Even the legendary experts could barely protect themselves here. The ship entered the Shangyang city. The experts stepped aside from the way. The soldiers above the city's walls didn't dare to stop the ship either. It was evident that the Piyuan villa didn't have a low status in the Shangyang city. Villa Lord Yen, it seems that your villa has a huge influence in the Shangyang city? Yi Shiwen let out a smile from the corner of his mouth as he looked at Yen Hongyi. Don't make fun of me, young brother Yi. I am only slightly famous in this city. Yen Hongyi replied. The ship arrived at an extremely big villa that was situated on the northern side of the city. Each house in the city was built like a huge building complex. The houses were spanning across the city. It was a magnificent sight. Villa Lord is back. The guards left to inform the people of the villa as soon as the ship arrived at the gate. Many old and young people gathered at the villa gate as a result. These people were the relatives of the experts that had gone out on the expedition. Yen Hongyi and the other experts stepped down from the ship. Then, a beautiful girl hugged Yen Hongyi and shouted, "Daddy, you're back." She appeared to be 17 or 18 years old. She had a small and beautiful face. Her skin was as fair as snow. Her big and round eyes were nimble and looked incomparably pretty. She was an extremely beautiful young girl. She was dressed up in fiery red dress which reflected her curvy figure. She also had a kind of indescribable agility in her. Yen Hongyi's face exposed a rare affectionate expression. He opened his mouth and said, "Of course, I am back. Where is your mother?" "Mother fell asleep," the young girl replied. Her wonderful eyes then turned towards Yi Shiwen. "You're Yi Shiwen, right? You're the one who helped my father in killing that fierce Starwolf King, aren't you?" These experts had already sent a message and had informed everyone about their safety. Therefore, it wasn't a surprise that she knew about Yi Shiwen as well. "Yun Ting, don't be impolite," Yen Hongyi said with a strict face. "Young brother Yi, I'm sorry. This is my daughter Yen Yun Ting. She has been pampered since childhood. So, she is a bit impolite. Why? I don't think he's that much older than me." Yen Yun Ting bit her lips and muttered resentfully, "Wow, this little sister is so pretty." Yen Yun Ting became surprised when she looked at Xiaoya, and her eyes started to shine. Yi Shiwen found her expression to be similar to that of those young girls he had seen in his previous life. They would have a similar reaction whenever they'd see a Barbie doll. Xiaoya's small and delicate face still carried a timid expression. It was also an expression of annoyance, but it looked cute nonetheless. Xiaoya didn't hide her face behind Yi Shiwen when Yen Yun Ting extended her palm towards her. She only grabbed his clothes. However, she seemed to be puzzled as she looked at Yen Yun Ting. Why does this elder sister look so surprised? Yen Yun Ting didn't feel embarrassed on seeing that Xiaoya wasn't showing respect to her. "Yun Ting, don't cause trouble." A serious look appeared on Yen Hongyi's face. He was afraid that his immature daughter might offend Yi Shiwen. After all, he and Yi Shiwen had gotten close on their way back. He had also found that Yi Shiwen didn't care much about ordinary matters. However, he cared a lot about that little girl who accompanied him. "Gee, I was wondering why there's so much noise." "I see, so the Villa Lord Yen has returned." Suddenly, a strange laughter sounded. Then, a group of men arrived walking through the street. They were headed by a young man who looked approximately 25 or 26 years old. He had pretty facial features. However, he had a gentle and reserved air about him. He was clad in a magnificent robe and looked like a playboy from his appearance. He was carrying a smile of mockery at the corner of his mouth. A group of experts followed him, and all of them were powerful sage experts who possessed a reserved aura. "It's you, Li Chuntian." An expression of disgust appeared on Yen Yunting's face when she saw this man arriving. "Li Qingtian? Li Clan's people?" This name immediately appeared in Yi Ziwen's mind. He had heard this name many times from the mouths of the people of the Piyuan villa while they were in the hallucinatory star field. Apparently, Both these clans had been enemies since many generations. The complexions of the Puanvilla's people would always turn ugly whenever they'd mention anything about the Li clan's people. And Yen Yunting's behavior had indirectly confirmed Yi Zaiwen's speculation. Why have you come here? Yen Hongyi's complexion also turned ugly as he asked with a serious countenance. How could this little nephew not have come after he heard that Villa Lord Yen had returned? Li Qingtian cupped his hands in obeisance and replied. However, there wasn't a trace of respect on his face. I heard that Villa Lord Yen had been roaming in hallucinatory Star Field during those days. I wonder how well this trip of yours has turned out to be. How dare you say that? You're a mean scum. We wouldn't have lost so many brothers if it wasn't for you. Yen Hongyi's complexion had turned very ugly. However, it was Hu Angua who had retaliated this time. Oh yeah, you see sometimes food can be eaten without hunger. But you must never talk nonsense. You yourself went to the hallucinatory Star Field. What does our Li clan have to do with that? Talking nonsense can get a person killed, you know? Li Cheng calculated secretly and said. Honestly, this young nephew is very surprised. I hadn't expected that Villa Lord Yen would return safely. An expression of hate appeared on the faces of the Puanvilla's people. After all, they knew that the Li clan's people had caused those troubles for them. However, they couldn't do anything. Villa Lord Yen, this young nephew has arrived here, and he wants to ask you something. What have you decided regarding the matter of marriage that I had mentioned last time? Li Qingtian's intense gaze fell on Yen Yunting's curvy figure, and a sinister expression flickered in his eyes. Get lost. I want to marry a person like you. Yen Yunting's small face turned a deep shade of red as she angrily replied. Chapter 529. Talking nonsense can really get a person killed. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga, Get Lost. I want to marry a person like you. Yen Yunting's face became flushed. She was gasping heavily in anger, and her bountiful chest was heaving. Her delicate face didn't have any deterrence force, but it still looked very charming. Yen Yunting, I'm talking to you nicely. Why must you always behave like this? I intend no harm to you. Li Qingtian shot a glance at Yen Yunting and said, You should leave. My daughter will never marry a person like you. Yen Hongyi stepped forward and coldly stated, Villa Lord Yen, you might want to give it a proper thought. Li Qingtian's complexion had turned cold. You won't want to put your Puanvilla in harm's way because of your momentary anger, would you? Li Qingtian narrowed his eyes as he said. Then, a trace of madness flickered in his eyes. Villa Lord Yen hasn't healed yet as far as I know. So, it would be better if you don't get too impulsive. Wasn't it your Li clan that used underhanded tricks to injure our Villa Lord? You get the hell out of here. Our young sister will never marry a scum like you even if all of us have to die to protect her. Hu Angua coldly replied. Do you have a death wish? Li Qingtian's gaze turned gloomy and cold as he threatened. He then flew out, arrived in front of Hu Angua, and shot his palm. Bang! Li Qingtian's palm struck Hu Angua's chest. A tremendous force exploded and sent Hu Angua flying away. He collided with several people before his backwards momentum finally came to a halt. Li Qingtian was a shameless scoundrel. However, he was incredibly strong as well. In fact, his strength had reached the late stage of the Sage Realm. Moreover, he had only been cultivating for several hundred years. So, he could be called a top-notch expert among the younger elites. However, Hu Angua had entered the Sage Realm recently. So, how could he be his match? Stop! Yen Hongyi moved into action. His big hand rose up and swept towards Li Qingtian to grab him. The space trembled and got distorted under the pressure of his big hand. One could well imagine the tremendous might carried by the attack of an angry expert of Sage Small Perfection Realm. At this time, the 5 experts standing in the front row behind Li Qingtian attacked at once. Layer upon layer of divine beams fell from above, and formed a big barrier of 5 elements: metal, wood, water, fire, and earth in order to protect Li Qingtian. Bang! Yen Hongyi's big hand grabbed this big barrier instead, and a dreadful rumbling sound swept out. Then, a terrifying aura proliferated in the surroundings. Li Chengtian merely laughed as the dust settled. He looked towards Huanghua. The man had already lost his consciousness. In fact, it wasn't clear whether Huanghua was dead or alive. Didn't I tell you? Talking nonsense can get a person killed, Li Chengtian said. Then, he turned towards Yen Hongyi and said, Villa Lord Yen, you're very impulsive. Li Chengtian's current ruthless appearance didn't divulge that he was the same person who had looked like an elegant young master a while ago. Yen Hongyi glared at him. However, he didn't rush towards him. Rather, he rushed towards those 5 individuals who stood behind him. However, he was surprised to see that each of these 5 individuals looked a bit similar to each other. All of them had a long and round waist and a burly figure. You're the 5 brothers of the Huang clan? Yen Hongyi looked at these 5 men with his ice-cold eyes. I've heard that each of you is at the Sage Peak realm. You've practiced the power technique of the 5 elements. So, you can lay down 5 elements great barrier to contend against the experts of the Sage small perfection level. Yi Shiwen had never heard about them. Therefore, he didn't give much importance to them. However, the countenances of the people of the Piyuan Villa had changed. After all, these 5 individuals were extremely famous in the Shangyang city. They had been famous for over 100 years because they could lay out the 5 elements great barrier. And they could even use it to contend against the experts of the Sage small perfection level. Sage small perfection realm and Sage peak realm differed by far. There were many experts of Sage peak realm in the Shangyang city. However, there were only a few experts of the Sage small perfection realm. After all, every Sage small perfection level expert needed to create a solid and deep foundation. And this was the disparity between the 2 realms. These 5 brothers were only at the Sage peak realm, but they could still contend against the experts of the Sage small perfection realm. Therefore, their names had become widely famous in the region. These 5 brothers had always been independent. They didn't belong to any force of the city. However, nobody dared to provoke them even then. However, they had apparently joined the Li clan. This was something that no one could have predicted. I didn't expect that the 5 Huang brothers would join the Li clan. They have become the hired thugs of the Li clan. It's no wonder that Li Chengtian has dared to come here so arrogantly to provoke us. The backing of these brothers has given him so much confidence. Everyone was angrily looking at the 5 Huang brothers. It wasn't surprising that Li Chengtian had such a carefree expression on his face. The 5 brothers of the Huang clan had collectively laid out the 5 elements great barrier. They surely couldn't defeat a Sage small perfection level expert. However, it was also very difficult for a Sage small perfection level expert to defeat them. Yen Hongyi had sustained new injuries of late. Plus, his old injuries hadn't healed either. So, his strength had decreased considerably. Villa Lord Yen, you should think about it carefully. After all, it will be advantageous for both our clans if Yunting marries me. After all, the bond between our clans will strengthen because of our marriage alliance. And we won't have to be afraid of anyone in this Shangyang city after that. What do you say? Li Chengtian recklessly proposed. He was confident that Yen Hongyi couldn't do anything to him as long as he had these 5 brothers to back him up. This was why he had hastily arrived here right after Yen Hongyi's return. I'm giving you 3 days to reconsider. I will return after 3 days. And I will either marry her or give you a declaration of war. I might as well inform Villa Lord Yen that my father has already reached the pinnacle of Sage small perfection realm. Moreover, he is planning to undergo closed-door training after my wedding. And he will reach the Sage Great Perfection realm in about 3 to 5 years. So, he will be able to dominate the entire Shangyang city at that time. Even the city lord won't be able to do anything to our clan. And your Piyuan villa will be destroyed if you reject my proposal. So, you must take the right decision since I genuinely don't wish to take that step. Li Chengtian threatened. However, nobody in the Piyuan villa cursed Li Chengtian for his arrogant and despotic behavior at this time. That's because they were still in a state of shock upon hearing that his father would soon make the breakthrough into Sage Great Perfection Realm. There was a big disparity between Sage Peak Realm and Sage Small Perfection Realm. However, there was an even bigger disparity between Sage Small Perfection Realm and Sage Great Perfection Realm. A senior expert of the Sage Small Perfection Realm could lay a strong foundation in the Shangyang City. However, a senior expert of the Sage Great Perfection Realm could dominate the entire Shangyang City. The current city lord of the Shangyang City was the only Sage Great Perfection Realm expert in this city. A proud expression appeared on Li Chengtian's face when he saw that everyone was in shock. This is the time to change the rule in Shangyang City. This is my Li clan's time to rule. However, his gaze suddenly fell onto Xiao Ya's body, and a fervently perverted look flickered in his eyes. This little girl is pretty good. How did I miss such a nice little thing earlier? I would have taken her home with me by now. Haha. Anyway, all these girls will be mine sooner or later. Li Chengtian's perversion became even worse. He licked his lips and said, "Dream on." Yan Yunting's beautiful eyes coldly glared at Li Chengtian. Suddenly, the rumor about Li Chengtian's interest in young girls echoed in her mind. There was no reason why she wouldn't feel disgusted by him. This is beyond your control. There is nothing that I can't obtain if I want to. Li Chengtian coldly snorted. He stretched his hand towards Xiaoya in order to grab her. The 5 brothers of Huang clan were standing behind him, and they were watching Yan Hongyi very nervously. They had gotten the information that Yan Hongyi had sustained serious injuries, and they knew that this had decreased his strength very considerably. However, he was still an expert of Sage Small Perfection Realm, and they could contend against him only because of their powerful barrier technique. In other words, they didn't dare to underestimate a senior expert of the Sage Small Perfection Realm. However, they soon realized that Yan Hongyi wasn't even thinking about attacking. Instead, a disdainful and gloated expression flashed in his eyes as he grinned. However, they couldn't understand why such an expression had appeared on his face. Idiot! Yan Hongyi secretly sneered in his heart. This Li Chengtian is courting death. However, Yan Yunting wasn't as confident as Yan Hongyi. Suddenly, a burst of energy emerged out of her body and soared upward. It was about to attack Li Chengtian. However, she then heard a bang sound. A big hand that was made up of energy stretched out from nowhere. It then pinched and crushed Li Chengtian's hand. Then, the energy hand transformed into a group of spirit energies and dispersed. Who are you? Li Chengtian's complexion changed as his sinister gaze fell upon Yi Shiwen. After all, he hadn't expected that this ordinary-looking young man would have effortlessly crushed and dispersed his attack. Yi Shiwen ignored Li Chengtian. He merely touched Xiao Ya's small head instead. He had seen that she had been scared by this incident, and her small face had turned deathly pale. So, he softly said, "Don't worry, I'm here." Yes. Xiaoya nodded. She didn't say anything else out of sensibility. Li Chengtian's complexion turned fierce after he saw that these 2 individuals had ignored him. He felt embarrassed as he furiously laughed. Ha! Interesting. Very interesting. Nobody has dared to interfere in my business for so long. So, you're obviously an outsider. I had cut off the hands of the last idiot who had dared to interfere in my business. I don't want much for you. I will only cut your limbs and hang them on the city wall for everyone to see. And then, I will see who else dares to interfere in my business. The 10 experts who were standing behind Li Chengtian also laughed nastily. They ran towards Yi Shiwen and surrounded him. All of them were sage experts. After all, Yi Shiwen was merely an expert of the intermediate stage of Sage Realm in their estimation. How could he face such an elite team? He would surely get crushed if he tried to face them. Li Chengtian took a glimpse at the expressions of those Piyuan Villa experts who had returned with Yan Hongyi. However, he found their expressions a bit strange. Also, why had Yan Hongyi not attacked yet? And why was it that he had an optimistic expression on his face? In fact, it seemed as if these people were looking forward to a good show. However, these thoughts disappeared from his mind as he ogled at Xiaoye with a lustful expression in his eyes. Anyway, Yi Shiwen was already a dead person in his opinion. Attack! It wasn't clear who had shouted among those experts. However, they rushed towards Yi Shiwen and issued their strongest attacks without any hesitation. They didn't seem to care that they might destroy this place. After all, it was Piyuan Villa's territory. "You're an audacious bunch," Yi Shiwen coldly snorted. His big hand stretched out, and that seemingly overwhelming barrage of attacks was instantly grabbed and extinguished by his big hand. These attacks didn't even get a chance to land. The complexions of those experts turned dull. After all, they hadn't thought that this would happen. However, they didn't get time to think much since Yi Shiwen had already made his move. He trod forward, transformed into a streamer, and arrived in front of one of the experts. Then, his big hand suddenly swept out. That expert couldn't avoid that hand. He could only watch it coming closer and closer. He could only stare blankly as that big hand slapped him on his face. Bang! That expert went out flying because of the tremendous impact. His teeth got smashed, his body rotated like a spinning top, and he went flying. Then he heavily slammed on the ground, and a huge crater opened therein. "You were right about what you said. Talking nonsense can really get a person killed." Yi Ziwen's eyes turned extremely cold. Chapter 530. You were right. Sometimes, talking nonsense can really get a person killed. Yi Ziwen's words seemed ruthless, as if they had come straight from hell. Xiaoye had been with him for less than a year. However, this quiet and well-behaved young girl's cuteness had won him over. So, how could he tolerate the fact that someone had harbored ill thoughts about her? Li Qingtian's sinister expression had frozen. Yi Ziwen's movement was extremely quick as he appeared in front of another sage expert like a golden flash of light. Then he lifted his foot and kicked that expert. The speed of his foot appeared to be slow. However, it was incomparably fast in reality. Therefore, that expert could only look helplessly as Yi Ziwen's foot hit his chest. Bang! Crack, crack! The sound of breaking of bones was heard along with a muffled scream. That expert was sent flying upside down. He crashed into the ground and opened a huge crater before finally coming to a halt. His chest and sternum got crushed by Yi Ziwen's kick. Moreover, he couldn't breathe either. So, it was hard to say whether he would live or die. Bang! 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 Yi Ziwen's golden figure flashed in front of those experts one by one. They also didn't get any time to react, and went out flying by his bombardments. They had been rendered breathless by the attacks. These people were basically the lackeys of Li Qingtian. So, Yi Shiwen felt that it wouldn't be a problem even if they died. Bang! Yi Shiwen arrived in front of the last expert, and sent him flying too. Everyone was in a state of disbelief, except those people of the Piyuan Villa who had returned with Yi Shiwen. Those people had no strength to fight back in front of Yi Ziwen's attacks. However, they were sage experts in their own rights. Li Qingtian's subordinates could only be considered as hired thugs. However, they were considered to be on the superior side in the Shangyang city. Li Qingtian finally understood the reason behind the gloating expressions on the faces of those people of the Piyuan Villa. They were laughing at my overconfidence. This young man possesses incredible strength. Li Qingtian's countenance turned even more distorted since he felt that everyone present there was ridiculing him. And all these things had happened because of the young man who was present before his eyes. "Kill him for me," he ordered the 5 Huang brothers who were present by his side. He didn't wish to believe that this young man couldn't be killed even after using the combined strength of the 5 Huang brothers. The 5 Huang brothers moved into action without any hesitation after they had heard Li Qingtian's command. Each of their bodies separately radiated the light of 5 elements: metal, wood, water, fire, and earth. They unleashed terrifying auras as the 5 elements' great barrier swept towards Yi Shiwen to crush him. The 5 Huang brothers were experts of the Sage Peak realm. Even one of them was enough to wreak havoc. And they could even contend against an expert of the Sage Small Perfection realm when together. This attack was different from the one they had used to stop Yen Hongyi a while ago. After all, they had attacked with their entire strength this time. The spirit energies of the entire Shangyang city had condensed at this place at a very high speed. Many experts of Shangyang city had also flown over to this place. However, they were witnessing this fight from afar because they couldn't dare to come near. After all, the Piyuan Villa was a big force in Shangyang city since it was home to many experts. Aren't they the 5 Huang brothers? I've heard that they've joined the Li clan. But why are they fighting here at Piyuan Villa? Li clan has gone off the leash. Li clan's clan lord is about to make the breakthrough into the Sage Great Perfection realm. He will dominate the entire Shangyang city after that. Piyuan Villa's Yen Hongyi has a very old enmity with Li clan. It is said that the wife of the villa lord Yen Hongyi had been courted by Li clan's clan lord as well. However, villa lord Yen married her in the end. In fact, this bitter enmity between these clans is more than 100 years old. The 5 elements Great Barrier shook the void as it arrived in an overwhelming manner. It surged forward and issued vibrations all over. The 5 Huang brothers had attacked with their entire strength and had unleashed their endless might in sync. Yi Ziwen's complexion had also turned a bit solemn. After all, he wasn't dealing with ordinary sage experts this time. Faint golden rays of light had begun to flicker on his body. The divinities were looming. Suddenly, a dreadful murderous aura swept out from his body and soared up. Consequently, cracks appeared in the void. Yi Shiwen didn't speak anything while facing the 5 elements Great Barrier. He merely stretched out his big hand. It transformed into a star and swept out. Bang! The star ferociously collided with the matrix formation of the 5 elements. The clash issued incomparably ferocious shock waves, and they instantly ripped apart the void. Even the fortified space of the city couldn't resist the impact that was produced by this collision. Everyone's complexion had turned pale in amazement. The 5 Huang brothers were legendary. But who was this young man? No one could believe their eyes when they saw that he hadn't fallen into a disadvantageous position while fighting the 5 brothers. The 5 brothers were also somewhat stunned. They had secretly locked most of their energy on Yen Hongyi's body. After all, they were afraid that Yen Hongyi might launch a sudden attack. They could indeed contend against an expert of the Sage Small Perfection realm. However, that was only possible when all 5 brothers fought together. Also, they could only contend against an expert of the Sage Small Perfection realm. But they couldn't defeat him. Therefore, they had to be careful at all times. However, they hadn't expected that Yen Hongyi would never attack, and that this young man who they didn't care about would be able to stop their attack single-handedly. They certainly hadn't used their full strength yet. Still, an ordinary person couldn't stop the 5 elements Great Barrier. After all, it had the power to blast away an average expert of the Sage Peak realm. Yi Shiwen landed on the ground. His black hair was fluttering in the wind. His eyes looked profound, and it seemed as if a universe had taken birth inside them. His fighting intention soared, and it seemed that he possessed a monstrous aura. Everyone had thought that he wouldn't be able to stop the attack of the 5 Huang brothers. However, everyone had been proven wrong. Young man, you're pretty good. But this is it for you. The eldest among those 5 brothers shouted. Simultaneously, his imposing aura surged sharply. It had become even more dreadful than before. The minds of these 5 brothers were interlinked. Therefore, they thought of the same thing. They knew that they had to attack this man with all of their strength this time around. In fact, they had stopped thinking about Yen Hongyi for the time being. Die! Yi Shiwen bellowed. He trod forward at an abnormally quick pace. Simultaneously, the golden rays of light emanating from his body became even more intense. He looked like a golden god as he rushed forward to face his enemy's attack. Yi Shiwen didn't use any special move, only his fist swept out. Yet, it carried tremendous power. He forged ahead relying only on the toughness of his body and took on the 5 Huang brothers. His monstrous aura could have scared a person to death. The aura spread out in all directions. Bang! 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 Yi Shiwen hadn't used any fancy moves. He had only shot his fists. The 5 Huang brothers had thought that Yi Shiwen either had a death wish, or he had gone crazy. After all, that was the only possible explanation for fighting them unarmed. However, they soon realized how mistaken they were. There was nothing stylish about Yi Ziwen's fist attacks. However, every fist had shaken their 5 elements great barrier. Li Chengtian's countenance had also turned exceptionally stiff on the other side. After all, he hadn't anticipated that Yi Shiwen would be so insanely powerful. In fact, he had initially thought that the 5 Huang brothers would take care of him with ease. However, Yi Shiwen had left them to tremble. Bang! Yi Ziwen's fist pounded on the 5 elements great barrier once again. Bang! The barrier shattered into pieces. Poof! 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 It seemed as if the 5 brothers had been accidentally struck by lightning. They spouted blood from their mouths as their bodies were sent out flying. Bang! They crashed into the ground, and a huge crater was formed. Li Chengtian became scared when he saw that Yi Shiwen was coming towards him step by step. Even his arms had begun to shake slightly. It wasn't that he had never seen a powerful expert. In fact, he had seen the strongest experts in Shangyang City. However, he hadn't thought that this ordinary-looking young man could wipe out the 5 Huang brothers within such a short span of time. After all, he had enormous faith in them. Otherwise, he wouldn't have come to the Piyuan villa so rashly. What do you want to do? Li Chengtian swallowed his saliva. He had become very nervous. Didn't you do what you wanted to do just now? So, now I will do what I want to do. Yi Shiwen replied insipidly. His expression looked cold, as if he was talking to a dead person. Li Chengtian had killed many people in his life. However, most of them were young and weak people. In fact, he would have collapsed very easily if he had encountered people who were far stronger than him. However, Yi Shiwen was different. Many of the people whom he had killed were more tyrannical than him. Of course, he had reached up to here after fighting and defeating all those powerful enemies. That's why he had a seemingly invincible aura, and Li Chengtian didn't. Don't you dare trying something. My father is the clan lord of the Li clan. The Li clan won't let you off easily if you so much as even touched me. Li Chengtian swallowed his saliva as he tried hard to maintain a stern look in order to intimidate Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen looked at him and shook his head as a look of disappointment appeared in his eyes. Li Chengtian was also a sage expert like those 5 Huang brothers. However, his aura wasn't even close to their imposing auras. In fact, it was simply pathetic. He was merely a weakling who depended on powerful connections and bullied the weak. And it was a waste to spend resources on trash like him. Li Chengtian noticed Yi Ziwen's disdain for him by looking at his facial expressions. Li Cheng's face became stiff. Then, a sly look appeared on his face. Go to hell! A sage-level long sword suddenly appeared in Li Chengtian's hand. And he hacked it at Yi Shiwen without delay. However, he realized that his sage sword had only slashed Yi Ziwen's afterimage. Suddenly, Yi Shiwen appeared in front of Li Chengtian and snatched the sage sword from his hand at a lightning speed. After that, he fiercely slapped Li Chengtian on his face. Bang! Li Chengtian's body rotated rapidly like a spinning top and went backwards at a very fast speed. His forehead almost got smashed and his teeth got shattered. Bang! Li Chengtian's body ferociously crashed into the ground, and a huge crater was formed. He lost consciousness soon after. They are tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.